Hi, welcome everybody. We're just waiting for everyone to join us from the waiting room. Okay then, so just a few more people joining us, but I will kick us off now as well. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our second symposium, a part of the Athlete Z series, continuing the conversation in athlete welfare. I'm sure that some of you might have attended the last symposium where we asked the question, where will we draw the line? But of course, athlete welfare and this topic is very, very broad. And so today we're asking another question, which sits within the duty of care in sport review, looking into inclusivity and diversity. So the question we're going to ask today is, who do we include in sport? We've got a number of great speakers for you today lined up, so I hope that you will enjoy the information and the experiences that they'll be sharing with you. In terms of housekeeping, if you've got any questions, just pop that straight in the chat, and our speakers will do their absolute best to answer those questions after their sessions. Of course, if they don't get to it, then feel free to get in touch with us, perhaps send them via Twitter and we can share them out to those speakers as well. So our Twitter handle is @athlete_Z. So please do give us a follow there and check that out. Of course, if you are currently within SimSpur, then this symposium is endorsed by SimSpur, so there is 1.5 CPD points as well for your attendance, so another added bonus. But as for that, I think that's all the information that you will need. So without any further ado, we can start to kick off our symposium, who do we include in sport? And I thought that it would be worthwhile just sort of starting with a quote that I think's really interesting from Megan Rapinoe, who is the women's football captain for the United States. And a quote that she said is, "This is my charge to everyone. We have to be better. We have to love more, hate less. We've got to listen more and talk less." So without any further ado, I hope that we can all indulge in some of that listening. And I'll pass this on to Nathan to introduce our first speaker. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rosie. I think it's a rather good introduction to our seminar today, and what a powerful message. And I'd like to introduce our first guest today, talking to us about diversity and inclusion in a different sort of football, rather the first football, arguably, from the Rugby Football Union. And I'd like to welcome Genevieve Glover, who is a WASP player and administrator throughout her rugby life, joining the club in 1991. During her WASP playing career, she held a variety of rugby administration roles, including the honorary secretary, and sat on the WASP executive committee for 15 years. She was made the vice president of the WASPs FC in 2003 and remains a treasury. Genevieve was also played representative rugby to England A level and is currently the trustee and chair of the Women's Legends Charity Foundation, a charity built on the WASP Past Players Network, male, female, amateur and professional, raising money for charitable causes. Genevieve is currently on the RFU Council and has been so since 2017, and chairs the Diversity and Inclusion Working Group. This group focus is building on inclusive and sustainable game through skilled and diverse leadership at club, constituent body and council level. In her professional life, she is a group HR director at Barchester Healthcare, a private healthcare provider specialising in residential and nursing homes and private hospitals. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Genevieve.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nathan, and good afternoon, everybody. Firstly, thank you to Oxford Brookes and UK Coaching and Adam, who I know, and I'll explain a bit more about that later, for inviting me to speak. It's a pleasure to kind of share some thoughts with you on what we're doing at the RFU. I'm going to share my screen, which I almost forgot then. Let me just do that. Go back to the beginning. So As Nathan has just said, I sit on the RFU Council and I have been since 2017. And what I'm just going to cover very, very quickly, because there's a lot of information that I want to share, and I want to do as Megan Rapinoe suggested, which is perhaps not so much talking that I don't get the opportunity to listen to some of your questions as well. So firstly, our objectives at England Rugby around diversity and inclusion, looking at the 4 key work streams and what our initial focus will be, some research headlines and the methodology in the approach that we're taking. And then the area that I focus on specifically is around leadership is on leadership and governance at club, constituent body and council. Constituent body, for those that aren't aware, is essentially a geographical area. So there are 63 council members on the RFU Council, and they represent Hampshire, Northumberland, etc., different geographical areas, as well as specific groups like students, National Youth Council, elite players, etc. I was thinking about the sort of journey that we've taken to this point, and Adam will recall, as he was part of the original working group that was created in 2017, that for the first 3 years of working with the RFU on this, the phrase I always used, it felt like it was walking through treacle. It was quite hard work, if I'm really honest. And I think it's fair to say with the new working group and this new context, which I'll go into in a bit more detail from August of this year, it feels like light and day in terms of how we're working and the support that we're getting. I think there are sort of 3 areas that I wanted to pick out on in terms of the context change. Firstly, we can't, and I don't think we should, ignore the tragedy that took place in May 2020 with the death of George Floyd, and then the response to that. I think that's been key to the change that's taken place, particularly in the context of the RFU. I think there's been some leadership changes at the RFU, and I have to recognise Sue Day, who's Chief Operating and Finance Officer, who's been instrumental in maintaining the pace on this activity. Genevieve Shaw, who's one of the independent non-exec directors that sits on the RFU board, and of course Bill Sweeney, who's the CEO of the RFU. And I think their leadership and their continued focus, despite the sort of financial and COVID related challenges that the RFU have gone through, has been very helpful. And then finally, sort of my council colleagues, it was always going to feel like we were turning the oil tanker. And I think that those council colleagues that are still sitting on council, I think they have learnt and they have listened, and they're increasingly understanding and contributing proactively, which is great. And we've also got new council members as well that have joined us that you know, have their own sort of clear views on diversity and inclusion and its importance within English rugby. So I think those are the key context changes. Just moving on to our objectives, it's quite interesting. These were set pre-COVID. So in terms of a vision, a successful and thriving game across England, well, you know, let's be honest, at the moment, there is no game in England, and it's the only sport. It's not the only sport that is not being played. Sorry, too many negatives there. So I would add at this point that it's also about the survival of the game. I wouldn't want to be over dramatic, but certainly, you know, there are lots of things in our lives, sport and otherwise, that need to get back to probably a new normal rather than the normal that we knew. Oh my word. So so I think that's quite key, and you'll see there the game objectives. I won't read them out because you can read them yourself. I think what's key here is that inclusion is at the core. You know, how can you enable positive player experiences on and off the field unless you had an inclusive culture? How can you ensure you know, player welfare is protected and well-being of players is supported if they don't feel like they belong and included in our sport? How can we support clubs to sustain and grow to reflect society if we're not inclusive? So, and you'll see there the sort of driving objectives, diversity, inclusion is written into that as well. So I think now more than ever, it's embedded into you know, the plan, the strategy for English rugby, whether it be looking at it from a player perspective, a leadership perspective, or a commercial perspective. Just moving on to the sort of key areas of focus. What we have done is divide it into 4 work streams, and you can see those there. So we have fans, followers, and partners, and you can see how that's broken down. We have staff and board. We have gameplay, and then we have game leadership, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail. That's the bit that I lead. What's quite interesting of those 4 work streams is that the fans and followers, the partners, gameplay, staff and board are all led internally. So they're led by staff members, employed staff, the board. The game leadership one is led by a volunteer, which is me, and the working group. And then bottom left, you'll see the initial areas of focus. I think it's fair to say that the pace of activity across the different work streams is slightly different. You know, what can I say? It took 3 years to get to a point where council brought in and supported 10 recommendations for change, and I'll go through those. One of those years was lost because there was other activity that was distracting people, but also, as I've shared, I don't think the context was quite as positive and supportive as it could have, should have been. So the initial areas of focus that you see there are those that have been really identified by staff and board in response to the research that they have pulled together, and I've got a summary of that to share with you. Just going on to the game and leadership, which is the area that I chair. The terms of reference for this group, bearing in mind we've already had 3 years of a different working group, so we've got 2 years effectively to implement the 10 recommendations that I will go through. We will contribute to other areas, we already are, and I can go through those, but fundamentally I have to be able to stand up at the end of the 2 years, so that's the end of next season, and say that we have implemented those 10 recommendations. It's not to say that you know, we'll have achieved our targets, however we measure them, and a box has been ticked. It's the beginning of change, and what will probably happen is some of it will start at council and work its way through. Some of it will start within our clubs and work its way up. So this is a longer term view rather than any kind of tick boxing or quick wins. And then in terms of reference, we're also very clear about the working group that I was to recruit to support me. For the first time within the terms of reference, there was a commitment to have 30% of the representatives on the working group to have protected characteristics. In the end, we actually achieved all bar one member of the working group has at least one protected characteristic. And there were also real clarity as to where the working group was to come from to be able to support the activity. So I have a vice chair in Ralph Nibbs, who has a significant background in playing rugby and is also head of HR and welfare at UK Athletics. It's quite interesting to get a different sports perspective. We have an independent in Amanda Bennett, who again is steeped in playing and administrating rugby and is also an independent consultant around governance and equality, diversity and sport. We have a representative from the National Youth Council, so it's a separate council for 18 to 25-year-olds. We have Kirsten supporting us on there. 3 people from the game, that's Wahid, Geraldine and Matt, and then 2 council members. We have Maggie and Peter supporting that as well, and that's the working group. What was quite interesting is recruiting to that group. This time around, we had 3 times as many applications as we did 3 years ago. As you'd expect from an HR professional, a very comprehensive recruitment and selection process to get to the final position, and at every opportunity, all those people that applied, they will now go onto our talent bank, so we can actually start building up a talent bank of people who want to make a difference within our sport. I think that's probably it on that one. So I'm just going to put the research headlines up there. You can read that. I'm not going to read it out to you, and this is all in the public domain as well. This was some research that the RFU undertook to really understand people's perception of rugby and their experience, primarily in playing it. But there's some quite interesting insight there. And in terms of a methodology in the development of the RFU D&I strategy, 4 key steps to that process. One is understanding, and so there is a huge amount of research that has taken place across a number of different forums and using data from other sources as well. 2 is then creating the plan. 3 is acting, and then 4 is monitoring and improving. Nothing groundbreaking there, but I think I'm hoping that the perception is that the changes that we are currently making and continue to intend to make, it isn't about low-hanging fruit, it isn't about headlines, it is about creating sustainable change, and that won't be quick. And so hopefully that's recognised as well. And as you'd expect across the 4 key work streams, there are measurable targets that we're setting across those key areas of focus, and then also timelines set, and we've got that set out to 2025. So just moving on to game leadership. So this is leadership within clubs, CBs, constituent bodies, and council as well. So these are the 10 recommendations that have been signed off. Again, you can read them. This isn't actually public yet. Hopefully it will be in the next 6 to 8 weeks. But essentially it's about creating a framework for the change. So, you know, understanding who we have working across our game as volunteer leaders, understanding how we recruit, and helping there to be more inclusive recruitment within our clubs and CBs and council. There seems to be a sort of thought that you have to have been a rugby player to be a volunteer within rugby, which of course is absolutely not the case. With my HR hat on, I do think volunteering adds value to kind of our professional lives as well. There's an element of awareness and training, which will be key all the way through. There's a case of giving visibility and transparency to who council are, what the standing committees, the working groups, to understand who is actually running the community game within England. So there's visibility, lack of, hopefully reduce some of the suspicion, but also the whole, if you can see it, you can be it. So an understanding of the journey that we've taken to get to that point, so people can actually visualize their own journey in getting to that point. And then also importantly, the National Youth Council, just brilliant group of individuals, clearly closer in age to those that are actually playing the game, and so making sure that they're more fully embedded within how within the governance of the RFU, so that they can reverse mentor, for example, the RFU Council, not only on things like, you know, playing rugby now rather than say 40 years ago, or perhaps 25 in my case, but also you know, technology, communication, that side of things. So it's quite wide-reaching. We are taking recommendations 2, 6 and 7 to council in February to get some sort of feedback before that implementation commences, and then we're taking recommendation 1 and 3, for example, to the April 21 council meeting, and that will include a rule change, which will be interesting to test commitment to what we're trying to achieve, and also the pace as well. And really, just to close, you know, other areas that we're looking at is a talent bank. You know, there is volunteer leadership development that's been provided by the RFU. So it's actually taking that alumni of individuals and ensuring they have visibility of the opportunities that come along, either representing the game or being an independent. We're identifying diversity and inclusion leads within each of the constituent bodies so that we can feed through them, and they can be a catalyst for change as well as them feeding through into us. We're supporting the RFU on the development of an equality impact assessment, because what they have at the moment isn't fit for purpose. Developing the equality, diversity and inclusion policy and statement, ditto, that's not fit for purpose either. And then also continuing to work with council members and others on evolving the language that we use. It's something that I firmly believe that you know, we all have a responsibility to use the right language, not least in ED&I context, and I've been working with council members individually on that, because there's been fear as to, you know, what they can say, what they can't say, the language that they should use, and obviously Sporting Equals are really been on the front foot in supporting us to be able to support them. Finally, on the governance side of things, I've mentioned the 4 work streams. We all feed into a coordination group, which has an overview of the strategy, representation there from Chief Exec, Chief Operating and Finance Officer, President of the RFU, Senior Vice President, Independent Non-Exec, Legal and Governance, Rugby Development Director, Project Manager and myself, and that obviously feeds into board and council, council obviously holding me to account, and also the board to account in this area as well. And just on the advisory group, I've actually got a conversation with the new chair of this advisory group this evening. We're grappling with the terms of reference. They've got to add value. They've got to feel like they're going to add value. They've got to be independent, but we've got to be joined up as well. So if anybody has any terms of reference for advisory groups in this context, then please do send them through. So any questions? And I would say in response to that sort of question Rosie posed at the beginning, who would you include in sport? My response is everybody. Why would you not? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Genevieve. I think we're just getting some questions through now, and I'll let you know shortly. One of the interesting ones that's come out almost straight away, and I suppose goes along with Stephen Griffin and colleagues' paper around about non-contact rugby and benefits of other forms of rugby, and how potentially the RFU are going to increase participation into the sport within those that have a disability. Not sure if you've got any comment on how potentially diversity inclusion on a sort of participation level, excuse me, might be something that D&I can influence.
Yeah, it's interesting. The question, there are two questions that have come, and I'll take them both at the same time, if I may. Is firstly, there's a question from Beth about why T has been missing, LGBT, which is a question that I asked, and also why disability is missing as well. If you recall, when I went through that slide, I was clear to kind of slightly put myself at arm's length from the initial area of focus. That was something that the staff at the RFU decided would be their areas of focus. We as a working group on behalf of council haven't actually made any decisions on that yet. I'm very aware that disability isn't there. When I asked the question about T, and forgive me, I don't claim to be an expert in this at all, I was told that the focus was sexual orientation, therefore it was LGB and T wouldn't be included, that transgender wouldn't be included. Forgive me if that's wrong. Hopefully that's answered the question.
Yes, I'm sorry, we just had another one come in. So one of the sort of issues, I suppose, that's been raised sort of subsequent to sort of participation has been the ban from World Rugby in terms of transgender women. And I suppose I'm not sure if it sat within something D&I were able to influence, but is there a way in which you see that could have been handled, and how the handling from England Rugby might differ from the viewpoint of World Rugby's current ban?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I wasn't involved in it. I did speak to Matt Webb, who's a member of the working group, and also he's chair of King's Cross Steelers, and also is heavily involved in Mermaid. So he was involved with that hat on. And I mean, the decision that the RFU made around transgender participation was taken 12 plus months ago, and communicated at the time. And aside from the elite game, their position hasn't changed. They are keeping a watching brief on the science. So other than elite, which is dictated by World Rugby, transgender players can continue to play below the elite level, as far as I understand. So in terms of how they could have handled that better, gosh, I'm not a PR or a comms expert, but I think there was a lot of there was a big response, I think, to the World Rugby communication. I found that quite interesting to understand the different perspectives. I think it'll certainly inform me when it comes back to council for us to discuss again when we feel there's enough information that we might want to discuss it again. But for the moment, I don't think our position will change.
Thank you very much for that. I think going back to one of your interesting points, you mentioned a connection with Adam, sort of, and one of the connections from his RFU days and myself. We both sat on the National Youth Council, actually, and I suppose one of the mentions you discussed about sort of reverse mentoring for the RFU Council. I wonder if you sort of unpack that a bit more and some of the challenges. Particularly the RFU as an organisation faces with sort of that age inclusion as well, and being able to be representative towards those that are actually playing the game. Yeah,
I mean, it's a great question. You know, the sort of quote from Will Carling remains about the sort of 57 old farts. You know, they are not as old as they were. There's certainly, you know, a number of them haven't played for decades. I mean, I haven't played for 25 years, and I'm certainly not the oldest, well, probably the youngest on council. I think, I mean, I suppose we can't forget that council members represent their constituent bodies. You generally, you can't be a council member unless you represent a constituent body. And by working within constituent bodies, you should have, in theory, visibility and access to both formally and informally current players. We certainly have schools and students represented on council, but obviously that's only 3 individual council members. So I think to an extent they have that insight, but also I know, having sat in council meetings when members from the National Youth Council stand up and speak, that the response is wholly positive. It just brings, you know, it just shines a light, and there's a warm glow literally on the proceedings and the contribution. And that's essentially what we're trying to replicate, is to embed the National Youth Council in the governance of the RFU and council. So, for example, recent changes have been that a couple of National Youth Council members will come to every council meeting, and then they will take on either to lead or contribute to key projects across you know, any activity that might be taking place during a season. And then also, I mentioned this talent bank. For me, you know, when we're recruiting to independent roles or representative from the game, you know, those are kind of ready-made people who you've got experience, passion for the game, have already demonstrated that they're prepared to give back, have already indicated that they wanted to continue to do so, and we know for a fact are significantly more diverse than the council as it is at the moment. So that's the sort of way in which we're trying to shake it up. But you can't get away from the fact, you know, even in a world where everything's done virtually, where to be a council member takes a lot of time. And you know, I spin many plates, and you didn't even mention all of them in my introduction. And the only reason I get this done is I'm bloody organised. But other people can get it. Most of them can get it done because they're retired. And that's the challenge. That's what we've got to try and address. And I'm not sure how we do.
I think one of the questions that has come through, and you sort of touched upon potentially the constituent bodies being part of the solution, but also part of the problem. I think is there any learnings or messages to send through to those sorts of bodies, and how they can get a diverse range that then can funnel up, particularly because they're going to be the voices that are represented on the RFU.
Yeah. I mean, you've highlighted one of the biggest challenges. The RFU, we cannot tell the CBs what to do. That's, I mean, it's as simple as that. We can encourage, we can lead by example, we can share best practice. You know, to an extent, you might, you know, align some funding according to achievement of certain things, but you can't tell them what to do. So absolutely. I mean, one of the key recommendations is around inclusive recruitment. You know, how to move away from, you know, Bob tapping Pete on the shoulder and say, right, it's your term as president now. So actually having job descriptions, person specifications, advertising roles, a proper recruitment and selection process with a panel that is representative and diverse, you know, having succession planning, looking outside the rugby community, looking within your community. So what does the community look like in Cornwall, Northumberland, Birmingham, Central London, etc., and ensuring that representation. And that's the key change, because unless we change it within the leadership at CB level, then we're not going to change it within the leadership at council. I mean, I was co-opted. I was the 5th woman on council ever, I suppose you could call it. We've got 7 women on council now. We have 1 representative from ethnically diverse communities, which is Maggie Alfonsi. But unless you're kind of co-opted, then how else are we going to do it? They have to be sort of filtered through the CBs, and that's the challenge, and that's the potential rule change. But you didn't hear it from me.
I think I'll paraphrase a question from John Willis here as a sort of last question before we release you to your diaries of activities that you probably have. If you could change the RFU or diversity and inclusion at the RFU, with no hold bars, what would you like to see happen? Wow,
what a change. What a question, and what a change. Huh. Gee. I think
very loaded for a Thursday afternoon, I appreciate.
Yeah, I think for me, it's about the CBs. I think it's about, you know, if money was no object, time was no object, people, volunteers was no object. I think it's, and every CB is different. So you know, there might be somebody sitting there going, well, you know, that's bollocks because we already do that. But for me, it's something around professionalization of how they run their CBs, because I think from that will come, you know, greater governance, perhaps greater finance to be able to fund, because clearly, you know, funding will be challenged for the next few years. Greater inclusion. I don't want to say better leaders, but different leaders. And I think that they're the jam in the sandwich, aren't they? They're like kind of middle managements in a corporate. So then they can feed that down and they can change it going up. So yeah, CBs.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Genevieve, and thank you very much for your time and your presentation. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Adam White to introduce our second session.
Great. No, and thank you, Genevieve, for that presentation. We really appreciated it, and I'm great to see some progress. So thank you. Next up, we have Dr. Rachel Bullingham, who will be looking at homophobia in women's team sports. Rachel Bullingham, having previously taught physical education in secondary schools, Rachel now lectures at the University of Gloucestershire. She completed her PhD at the University of Winchester, where she investigated homophobia within female team sports. Rachel still researches aspects of homophobia both in sport and education settings, and has also published on concussion in sport. Dr. Rachel Bullingham, there you are. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you, Adam. I'm just going to share my screen. If you can just tell me that it's all good and you can see everything, that would be great. Let me just make it big. Are we all good?
You can see your screen. Over to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Yeah, so thanks very much, Adam, for the invite today. I really enjoyed the first Athletes E conference, so it's great to be able to speak at the second one. As Adam said, I'm going to talk to you today about homophobia in women's team sport, and this is predominantly stuff out of my PhD, but also a project that I did with Dr. Claire Marie Roberts, where we looked at elite sports. So it's kind of a combination of a number of different projects, and hopefully give you a flavour of the kind of things that we have found. So women in sport is very different to the male experience, and there's a kind of a number of reasons for that. The first one is that there have been specific anti-lesbian policies. Men haven't kind of had this in the same way. Renee Portland, who had a 27-year rule in Penn State as the basketball coach, who was incredibly successful, had training rules of no drinking, no drugs, and no lesbians. There's a really explicit way of suggesting that lesbians were not welcomed and not on the team at all, and her reign came to an end surrounded by a lawsuit, but that, you know, it was well known that this was a kind of training rules of hers, and it kept going for a while. And it was very explicit, and that, you know, this is something that has been reported in the American collegiate sport of an idea of you kind of don't want to go to over there because they have lesbians on their team, or so on and so forth. And the reason for this being slightly different for women in sport is we've called it the social lesbianization effect, and it's more easily put, I suppose, is the orange squash effect. So if you imagine a glass of water and you put some orange squash in it, the whole glass goes orange. And that's no different to female athletes on a team. So if one athlete comes out, there is suspicion on the rest of the team. So this kind of orange squash effect, that one athlete can cast suspicion on to their teammates, whereas men don't have that problem. If a male athlete comes out, there is no suspicion on their teammates. So it's a unique problem for women that has been seen kind of in variety of research, kind of in the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s. But things are changing. This is from the Lionesses Twitter account. You can see the rainbow flag. You can see the player wearing the rainbow armband, the players celebrating in front of a reasonable crowd. And this is a real kind of shift. And we can see this also with players like Megan Rapinoe, who's been mentioned a lot today. the number of openly gay players that were playing at the Football World Cup was something around 30. And the number of players coming out has been ever increasing, and that's showing a change of environment that female athletes are facing. And we can see that kind of shift that Griffin talked about in 1998 in her book Strong Women, Deep Closets, three environments. So hostile, where lesbian participation was prohibited and you must conceal your identity for fear of repercussions, and that there has been research on that and showing the kind of repercussions that women faced. There is conditional tolerance, the glass closet, so everyone can see but nobody ever talks about it, or don't ask, don't tell, which is taken from the American military, where it was okay to be gay as long as you just didn't talk about it and didn't tell anyone about it. And what's really interesting here is you can see that Griffin suggests what you might see in an open and inclusive, so it can be more open without as much concern. And this was kind of this where my research fits, and I wanted to do my research to see whether these climates existed and where we kind of were within these climates today. And I suggest that I predominantly saw open and inclusive, but actually it was more than that, potentially welcoming and supportive. And I'll talk through reasons why I suggest that it's kind of moved beyond simply open and inclusive to welcoming and supportive. So particularly at recreational level, it has I found that athletes were really supportive of each other. So they openly said that they take care of each other, they look after each other, they're there as people who help and support each other, whether that's through sport or in their personal life or so on and so forth. In terms of what Griffin was talking about in the climates, there wasn't kind of a suggestion of what it might look like, but what I found within recreational environments particularly were partners were welcome. So not only to watch the game, but they were welcome to socials, and female partners were actually welcome to socials more than male partners, because they fit into the group. So there was no longer this climate of kind of don't mention it, don't ask, don't tell, but actually, yeah, sure, your partner can come along and they're very welcome to come to our socials. And kind of considering that, and that they're beyond open and inclusive, some athletes I spoke to actually said that they found their club because the club had advertised in the LGBT community. So they actively sought to get people from the LGBT community involved in their sport, and they'd seen that as a really clear sign that it was going to be an environment that was welcoming and supportive for them, and that they were able to participate in, and they could be open about who they were without any fear of repercussions. But perhaps the thing that stood out to me most from what I found was, for the first time, athletes were saying it was actually easier to be out of the closet than in. So I had people say things like, I lost all my friends while I was being very secretive about my partner. I didn't want to tell anyone. I didn't want to think about sharing that information with anyone, and I pushed everyone away and kept them at arm's length. And what they found was, once they came out, they actually got all their friends back, and they the participants were saying that it was actually easier once they'd come out than when they were in the closet, because things were they were able to be open, and they didn't have to lie anymore, and they didn't have to be secretive. So that was a real shift. And that links really nicely to kind of coming out, and the changing nature of coming out. Coming out used to be a big event. It used to be a party. Everyone had their coming out story. And now that's just quite simply not the case. A lot of participants said that they came out to their team first to see kind of how it was and get the support they needed before they told their family. One participant actually, their family kicked them out after they told them, but their teammates took them in and looked after them, and they sofa surfed around their teammates' houses for a while. But linking with that, in terms of coming out not being this kind of party anymore, that people came out quietly, they dropped it into conversation, it was no big deal, they mentioned their partner, they used the right pronouns, and it was just that idea that you could just bring it up in normal conversation, and you didn't have to have, as some of them said, party poppers to make a statement. You didn't have to stand up and say, you know, this is me and this is who I am. It was just part of a conversation. And linking with that is the athletic capital being a non-issue. So you no longer had to be the best player on the team to come out, which has been found in previous research that you did have to be kind of the best player. That just wasn't the case with what I found. And athletes were able to come out regardless whether they were a starter, they were the best player, whether they were just on the bench, or whether they were completely new to the team. Like I said, there were no parties. A lot of them commented, you know, that I didn't have a party, there was no party poppers and so on. It was this idea of coming out quietly and also dismissing labels. And this is something that we really want to look into more. And they didn't necessarily want to be labeled as in a particular way for that to define them. Things were much more fluid than had been found in previous research. But it wasn't wholly positive. Predominantly, it was positive what I found, but at elite level, things were a little bit different. And that's why Claire Marie and I tried to examine things at elite level a little bit more. We found some kind of differences with spectators, and some spectators being homophobic when they were watching female games. Quite why anyone would choose to go to a female game and then start shouting homophobic abuse, I do not know, but that's what had happened. Elite athletes also mentioned travel. So, you know, the difficulty of having those camps abroad in countries where homosexuality is against the law. You only have to think about in men's football, particularly where the next World Cup is, or where previous Olympics have been. To see this can be a very big problem for athletes deciding whether or not they would be safe to go on either a camp or indeed to a competition. And there was a distinct shift from club to country. Athletes did acknowledge that, and they said that at country level things were different, and it was different within the elite environment. There was more pressure, and there was this emphasis on winning, and that kind of really took over in terms of this distinct shift from club to country. And some of the elite athletes we spoke to didn't enjoy that shift. You know, some really did and really thrived on it, but some didn't enjoy that shift from club to country. And there was definitely this idea of elite culture, and within that is kind of wrapped up with media and sponsorship, which again needs looking into more. One of the athletes I spoke to, part of my PhD, was told by the governing body in a media briefing not to talk about sexuality. Luckily, the players stood up and spoke out against that. But you know, if you've got governing bodies kind of giving that message that it's not okay to talk about sexuality, you can see that they're potentially still an issue at elite level. And sponsorship, there's always a fear of losing sponsorship. No athletes we spoke to lost sponsorship, but it's this overarching fear that kind of hasn't got over since, I guess, the 1980s with Martina Navratilova and Billie Jean King. That still hangs over players with this fear that they might lose some sponsorship. And again, that needs more emphasis. Moving forward, there's a clear need for more research in terms of context. One of my MRes students has just finished her thesis on individual sports. She's hopefully listening to this, and we're hopefully getting that out to be published in the not too distant future. So, you know, that is something that needs looking into even more. She's done a good sample, but it's quite a small sample, so we need to broaden that out across individual sports and see how things vary across individual sports compared to team sports. We definitely need more at the elite level. Claire Marie and I spoke to some elite athletes, but we need a broader sample, and I think that might be somewhere where actually we struggled with access, and trying to get athletes to take part was pretty tricky. They're very busy people. It's not to say that they didn't want to talk to us, but one athlete, I took over 8 months to arrange an interview with her. So it might be something that can be more led if we had an in with that. It's very difficult to get hold of elite athletes to want to talk to us, but I'm not convinced that's because they don't want to. I think it's because they're under a lot of pressure and that they're very busy. So that's something that needs to be considered. And moving forward, we're doing a lot of work at the minute, media coverage, certainly looking at Megan Rapinoe, looking at the media coverage of her in the World Cup, but also the kind of commentary that around players who are openly gay, and this idea of policy to practice. A lot of people are talking about equality, diversity and inclusion, but what does that actually mean for the players? And particularly with what we found at elite level, that shift from policy to practice is key and could be really important, and something that needs to be looked into a little more. So that's a very short snapshot of kind of overview of things that we found both at recreational and elite level. I'm going to stop sharing, and hopefully there are some questions.
Great. No, thank you ever so much, Rachel. A really interesting talk, and I know your work exceptionally well, so I will not try and ask too many questions, despite being very excited. The first question from Ruth today is, did you or do you know of any research about homophobia towards lesbians in mixed sex sporting environments, i.e. not just women's teams?
No, so thanks for the question. It's a great question, and no, I don't know of any. I think the only one that it could be anywhere near is there's been some work on inclusive masculinities done on cheerleaders, but that was from a masculinity standpoint rather than from anything on women in sport. That hasn't been done, and I guess I could add that to my list of contexts, individual sport and mixed sport. I think the reason for not much work being done on that is because there aren't that many sports that are mixed. There are a few, but I guess the predominance are team sport, and we're starting from a point where we really needed to update the women in team sports. So we started kind of there. We've moved on to individual sports with, like I said, my MRes student Beth Burgess, who's on hopefully listening. And mixed sport is somewhere we can go in the future, but not as far as I'm aware. But I will certainly keep my eyes out, and yeah, if you tweet me and at Bullrack, then I will do some digging and let you know if there's anything out there.
Great, thank you, Rachel. The next question is probably quite a quick one. Can you just tell us how many female athletes you conducted this research with? Yes.
Sure. My PhD was 31 athletes, recreational up to elite level, and the elite athletes, you're testing my memory, I round between 6 and 8, I think. So really small numbers, I appreciate, but it's a starting point. We're very aware that it is a starting point, but in terms of my PhD, the results, apart from at elite level, were very consistent across recreational, and I covered a really wide range of sports. From roller derby to lacrosse to hockey, netball, and some players were the only player on their team, and some players were in teams with a lot of players. So I had kind of the context, but maybe need more numbers. But good question, and yeah, a wider sample pool is needed.
Sure, brilliant, thank you. Do you think this applies to all female sport, or is it more prominent in certain sports, Rachel?
That's really interesting, and it's great to see some of my students asking questions, so I'm really pleased. That's a great question. The results were different for women's football. I think women's football did have slightly different results than other sports. I think there is still some hangovers in women's football particularly, and things were still inclusive, but there was more worry within those sports, within football, and there were kind of different experiences within football. So that was the only kind of outlier I had was in football, really. And again, a football specific project would be something that could be considered in the future, because they were slightly different results. Things like one participant said to me that they were worried about the changing rooms and how they talked in front of junior athletes, even though they had no reason to worry. It was just kind of a hangover, I guess, from horror stories they'd been told previously.
Great, thank you. John Willis has asked, are there any books coming out on this topic? And just before you answer, Routledge has sent us some key texts and relevant books for this symposium, which is available on our website, athletez.co.uk. I feel like I'm in America and playing, anyway. So Rachel, do you know of any books that will be coming out on this topic in the future?
That's a great question. There is a book that's out already called Out in Sport that I know pretty well, because I wrote it with Dr. Eric Anderson and Dr. Rory McGrath. So that one, it came out in 2016, but I think the results are still highly relevant. We're working on a Routledge handbook at the minute, which is more gendered politics, but there is some aspects of sexuality in there, I think. But for me, I would always go towards out in sport, because that kind of has both male and female and a broad range in terms of context.
Great, thank you. Why do you think more sportswomen have come out as being part of the LGBT community compared to men, for example, within football?
Thanks, Hayley. Great to see one of my third years asking questions. Excellent. I'm glad they're here. Yeah, great question, Hayley. I think previously things were more tricky for female athletes with the kind of orange squash effect that I talked about. But there's because so many athletes have come out, it's been easier. There's not so much a spotlight when athletes come out. There is a bit when they're kind of a big athlete and a big name within the sport, but because there are so many, it kind of dilutes the any media coverage or anything like that. I think for men in sport, it's always perceived as very homophobic, and that's not necessarily the case. But if an athlete came out, for example, in the Premier League, which is a question that Adam and I get asked fairly frequently about athletes coming out in the Premier League, that it potentially would be one athlete taking all the spotlight, and that's a lot of heat for somebody to take. Whereas for women in sport now, because we've got a lot of athletes that have come out, it kind of dilutes it for everybody, and there is not so much of that spotlight. And that has been helped by trailblazers coming out and not receiving homophobic abuse. And so athletes have seen that hasn't happened, and then been able to come out as a result of that.
Great, thank you. One from our friend Ian Braid. Do you know whether sports councils assess sports on their ability to overcome this discrimination in their funding agreements with NGBs? And if not, why not?
I don't know the answer to that question, Ian. And I know there is quotas in terms of on boards and so on, but I don't know in terms of overcoming discrimination. I think NGBs is a different in terms of when you're talking about governance. I'm definitely coming from the athlete perspective rather than the governance. Lucy Piggott's work on sports governance shows why there aren't that many women at the top of the NGBs, and I think you need to get more female athletes there before it you know, in terms of discrimination, you get more women there, then other kind of protected characteristics will follow. But I would look at Lucy Piggott's work on sports governance is kind of covers women in that area. But sorry, Ian, I can't particularly answer that question.
Great, no problem. Just one from Nick Evans at St Mary's. Where's this research going next?
Thanks, Nick. Great question. Well, like I said, we're working with my MRes student to look at getting her work on individual sports published. I need to get some of the work out there, some of the stuff on elite athletes we haven't got through to publication yet. But I guess looking through the more context in terms of the context that I said, so individual sports, mixed sports, as was brought up in the questions, and elite sport, you know, linking back to Ian's question, it'd be great to work with NGBs, because that difference in elite sport was quite distinct. And, you know, it wasn't that long ago that the athlete I spoke to said that the NGB did a media briefing to tell them not to talk about sexuality. And it'd be interesting to see kind of what change has gone on, and looking at it from, you know, an organisation's perspective, and linking with those elite athletes.
Great. Are there any things we could do as younger, I don't know why I'm saying this like it's me, are there any things younger sportswomen and men could do to promote a more equal position and to limit this hangover effect?
Yeah, I think young people are doing a sterling job actually at this, because it's normalizing it and not making a big deal. You know, when I was talking about athletes coming out and the fact that you can come out quietly now, that didn't happen before, and that has happened because younger people coming through are much more inclusive with their attitudes. And I do a lot of work in equality and diversity within the university, and it's the students that are challenging whether that's academic staff or staff that work within student services with their inclusion. And so the change is coming from the bottom up. So in terms of what younger people can do, to keep doing what you're doing, and call people out, not necessarily, I say that, but not in an aggressive way or anything like that, but just let people know what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And the inclusive attitudes that young people are showing is the thing that is starting to make the difference. And I can't wait until those younger generations kind of get through into being in charge of the sport, because I think the change then will be huge.
Great, and thank you. And I think this will probably be our final one. But do you think that female heterosexual athletes face barriers and challenges when entering sports such as rugby and football?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think there are perceived challenges and barriers. I'm not sure that there are any more, but again, that would be something to look at from a heterosexual perspective. I've only been talking to openly gay and lesbian players. They seem to think things were much more positive, but it might be interesting to talk to heterosexual players. But in terms of barriers and so on, that they seem to have certainly disappeared at recreational level, but there still might be that hangover. And I guess the way to get over that is to shout about the work more and say how things are improving. Sport is always seen as this really homophobic institution, and I'm just not sure we can get away with saying that anymore. Things are changing, and the work has shown that across female and male sport. Yes, there is still steps to take, but things are improving, and that inclusion will benefit everyone. It won't just benefit lesbian women; it will benefit all women. So I think the more work that's doing the in terms of inclusion, the media coverage that people are getting, and that being less trivialized, marginalized, and so on, all of those things are really proving that the barriers are really coming down and allowing women to take part in sport that they want to.
Great, brilliant, and thank you. And Rachel, there are a number of questions still in the Q&A box, and there are some in the chat as well, so I'm sure I'm going to put the pressure on for you to respond to as many of those as you can. So apologies for everyone asking really great questions, and obviously time not permitting. So thank you, and thank you for a really interesting talk and discussion there.
Thank you very much, Adam. I will get on to those Q&As now.
Brilliant. And then just finally, if people want to engage with most of the speakers are on Twitter. I know that athlete_Z is tweeting loads today. So please do engage with that as well. It's really important that we get this message out beyond this symposium and into the wider sporting world. So great. Dr. Simon Phelan.
Thanks very much, Adam. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker today. I get to introduce Esther Jones, and she'll be talking about her lived experience in accessing sport, physical activity. Esther is a former Paralympic and world champion. She's the world record holder of the 400 meters and the T38 for athletics. She's represented her country at 3 Paralympics, 2 athletic world champs, and the CP ISRA world champs or world games. By the end of her career, Esther had held several Paralympic and World Championship records. She'd won 3 Paralympic medals and 8 World Championship medals. So her pedigree in the sport is kind of without question, you might say. After retiring, she wanted to continue her involvement with disability sports and transfer it into coaching. She's worked with UK Athletics and Disability World-Class Potential and Performance programs from 2002 to 2006. And she's been involved in disability sport for over 32 years as a volunteer, as an elite coach, as a tutor, as a coach educator, and as a sport development person. She currently works for UK Coaching for 16 years and is now the diversity and inclusion manager. And I will hand over to Esther now.
Hi everyone, I hope you're well, and thank you so much for having me today. I'll have to apologise about the headphones, but we have some homeschooling going on, so I'm just going to try and make sure that I minimise the background noise. As I say, thank you very much for the introduction and for having me on today. If you just bear with me, I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Sorry, just bear with me a moment. There we go. We get there in the end, don't we? Okay, I'm just going to see that you can just check that you can see that okay. And for some reason, I have just lost my chat box, but no worries. I'm sure we can have a look at some of the questions at the end. So as I say, thank you very much for letting me come and speak this afternoon. I'm here today. My name is Esther Jones and I work for UK Coaching, and I have done for a number of years, but I'm now the recently appointed Diversity and Inclusion Officer. But really, I wanted to come and speak to you today, and I've been asked to talk to you about my lived experiences in sport as a disabled person and what I've learned along the way. And so I'd just like to really share that with you today, really, and show you how that's impacted on my life, really. I've been involved, as I say, in disability sport and sport for over 32 years, but it was potentially a very different story for me as a youngster in terms of my relationship with sport and physical activity. So as a youngster, I went to a mainstream school, which I believe was quite unusual in the 80s. And I'm not going to share my age, but you'll see from the competitions and things, I'm certainly an athlete of the past, shall we say. It was quite unusual, I believe, to go to a mainstream school in the 1980s as a disabled person. But that said, I have quite a minimal level of impairment. So I have cerebral palsy, but it's a very minimal level in terms of my impairment. So I didn't generally feel any different to anybody else growing up, but it wasn't until I went to school really that I became very aware from an early age of how differently I was viewed by others. So I think without a doubt I walked differently, although it's not something that I really noticed. And I certainly didn't have a lot of coordination or any balance, or very little balance, wasn't very good at balance. And I couldn't throw or catch or skip. And you know, although I felt the same, I was very much kind of picked on and picked on quite badly for my physical differences. And I really felt at my most vulnerable when doing anything that made my disability stick out more. And that was usually when doing something like sport or physical activity. I was extremely keen on sport and physical activity. I rode horses as a youngster. I loved playing tennis, or trying to, and actually I still do. And I even kind of made it into the school netball team, and I was always really fiercely competitive, even though I had to work kind of twice as hard to learn the skills that others just seemed to have. So, you know, those of us who went to school in the 80s will remember, you know, skipping was the big thing, and it's what we did in the playground every day. And again, it took me quite a while to master those skills, but I got there because it was really important for me to kind of blend in and fit in with my friends. Fitting in at school was quite difficult, really, I think, because because I had such a minimal disability. There were a lot of my friends who would say to me, you know, don't call yourself disabled. You know, we don't see you in that light. We don't see you as one of them. And I don't know if anyone's ever had that said to them before, but it's quite an unsettling term, you know, one of them, in any context, really. But then, of course, there were other people who couldn't wait to tell me that I was different and kind of call me names and point out my differences. So in the end, I actually kind of ended up feeling quite not very confident as a person, not quite sure where I fitted in as a person in society, really. And I think when you're young, it's really important that you fit in, that you can connect with your peers. So in the end, in a bid to help me come to terms with who I am, my mum, who was also a physiotherapist, and I was very lucky that she was in terms of her attitude, introduced me to a fantastic organisation called CP Sport. And CP Sport did then and still does now, you know, provides some excellent opportunities in terms of sport and participation to help disabled people get involved in participating in sport. But for me, it was a lot more than that as well. It was also an opportunity to meet other disabled people. And I know that might sound quite weird, but you know, going to school in a mainstream environment, I was the only disabled person in the school. Didn't know anyone else who had a disability, and it was quite isolating in terms of trying to work out, you know, who I was. You know, because you didn't have any kind of other peer support or role models. Tanny Gray, obviously she's a fantastic role model in sport now, but she wasn't the Tanny Gray that we know that now when I was growing up in sport and physical activity. And actually we were on a team together when she became the Tanny Gray that we know now, and that was Barcelona in '92. But anyway, I became really good at you know, the things that I had managed to do in terms of being active at home with family and, you know, playing sport at school. It wasn't a great experience for me, but I was really passionate about being sporty and active, and so I got involved in CP Sport, really thrived in all the different opportunities, and really developed a love for sprinting and athletics, sprinting in particular. And I was encouraged by a group of coaches involved with CP Sport at the time to go back and join my local athletics club, because I became, you know, I didn't want to do sport and physical activity with other non-disabled people, because it was never quite it wasn't a safe environment for me, and I felt very different. So they encouraged me to go back to the athletics club, to go and help me. And it was obvious, if I wanted to be better at athletics, I needed to go to athletics club and, you know, link to athletics. But to be honest, I think this is where some of my own biases kicked in. So as I say, it wasn't going to be a positive experience. I think the experiences that I felt in education, what I'd experienced in the rest of my life, I carried that with me into sport initially, in terms of I didn't think it was going to be a very welcoming place for me to be. And actually we did go down, and the first club that I went to, the first coach that I approached in the club, and I went and introduced myself, said who I was, and I went there with my mum and met the coach. And I can't remember what the conversation was, but I'm assuming somewhere it must have popped up that you know, was involved in CP Sport. I'd been I'd identified as quite talented, and I wanted to progress in performance. But the response that I got from that coach at the time was that although he would love to work with me, he hadn't done the disability training course, so he felt that he wasn't the person to work with me. And he suggested that I went and joined the throws coach at the club instead, because he had done the training. And if I look back at that moment now, you know, and at the time I was really quite confused by that, because I know what I wanted to do. I wanted to get involved in sprinting, and I didn't know much about athletics, but I knew that going to the throws coach wasn't really going to improve me in terms of my sprinting ability. So I look back at that and I kind of go, okay, well, we had a real good combination of people there. At that time we had myself, so I knew as much as anybody about my own cerebral palsy. You know, I'd lived with it all my life. I'd been active. I know how it does or doesn't affect what I do. Not that there wasn't things to learn about that. You know, there was my mum there that was a physiotherapist, so she again had 25 years experience of working with people with a physical impairment. And then there was the coach, who was, you know, a qualified sprints coach, and who was the, you know, the technical knowledge and the knowledge of the sport. So, you know, those three people there would have been a fantastic combination if only we'd been able to have a conversation, and the coach had just been a little bit open to talk to me about what potentially my needs might have been, instead of perhaps making assumptions that he wasn't the person to work with me because I had a disability. And so were there some quick decisions in him there? I'm not sure, but we didn't get the chance to have that conversation because he made it quite clear that he wasn't the person to work with me. So luckily at the time there was two athletics clubs operating at the same time at a track, and that's not always the case. And so I walked from one side of the athletics track to the other, and went and spoke to the other club and the other sprints group, who took me in and began to support me in sprinting and obviously athletics. And as we've mentioned before, you know, over the last 13 years, I was lucky enough, I say lucky, there was a lot of hard work in there as well, to go and become world and Paralympic champion and compete at 3 Paralympic Games, etc. And I think for me, one of my biggest moments in athletics, don't get me wrong, the medals were fantastic, but one of the moments that I'll always remember in athletics is being part of a supportive club at the end of my career, and it was Mansfield Harriers and Athletics Club. And, you know, one of my proudest moments was wearing their vest and representing them at the County Athletics Championships in 2000. And yes, I actually happened to get the time that I needed, the qualifying time for the Sydney Games in 2000. But actually the real, you know, the real buzz for me on that day was that I was part of my club. I was putting points on the board for the club, and, you know, that was really important for me, and that's what I wanted. That because I, you know, was absolutely loved athletics, and I really want to be part of it. So I know I achieved so much over my career, absolutely. But now 20 years after my retirement, and the medals are kind of stuffed in a shoebox somewhere, and I'm really not joking, I'm not quite sure where they've all gone. You know, I realise, you know, what the real value to me as a person is in sport and physical activity. So I've been involved in some fantastic organisations, you know, CP Sport I owe a lot to as a person, as an athlete, but also as an individual wanting to move into sports development. Obviously my performance career as an athlete. I then went on and started coaching, and was involved in several squads and the Athens Games as part of the track team under Keith Antoine, who's a brilliant sprints coach, but also a great mentor to me. I met my husband through athletics. My career opportunities opened up through sport and physical activity. And I think this is a time when, as a youngster, there was a lot of doors being shut to me. So education was difficult. I had quite a difficult time through school, both in terms of you know, education, but also aspirations of teachers, understanding what I needed, the help I needed. My career choices, I actually wanted to go into the armed forces. I was dead set on following my dad into the armed forces. And I remember going to a careers event at some point and being told, again very nicely, I'm really sorry, the armed forces aren't for somebody like you. And I guess there was all those kind of things that I was dealing with in society. And I like to say that, you know, sport, or to be really specific, coaches, you know, were the key constant for me, and coaches were the people that supported me all along the way, to be kind of, you know, who I am, navigate through not only my sports career, but also the career, and obviously where I am now, you know, very honoured to be working for, and very proud to be working for UK Coaching. So that journey for me, working with UK Coaching, I started when I retired and went into coaching. I really wanted to change the experience that not only I'd had, but I know that a lot of other disabled people struggle to find coaches and opportunities for people to work with them. And so I went into tutoring, and I went and I tutored for an awful long time how to coach disabled people in sport alongside what I was doing in coaching. And my main reason for that was for me to be able to put back into sport and coaching, really, and just help to tackle what the only thing that I could describe as really almost like what I felt was the fear factor around working with disabled people. And you know, to put my finger on the fear factor, I think we've mentioned it before. For me, things about you know, terminology, not wanting to upset somebody, also kind of worried about, you know, whether you're going to damage somebody by doing sport, you know, can you do something wrong and damage somebody, and that real close connection between, you know, somebody who has a disability, but also medical implications, which obviously there can be, but that's not always the case, that there's extra medical things. So I think it was really important just for me as an individual to want to put something back and really just give and get involved in these workshops and give coaches the opportunity just to talk about you know, how they felt about working and including disabled people. And so that was kind of my feeling, my gut feeling from my experiences, from the experience of others that I worked with. I still see it to this day, disabled people being told that they can't join a club because people aren't insured. You know, so although I'm not an athlete, I hadn't been an athlete for 20 years, you know, I think experiences like this are still happening. And we know from our YouGov survey that we carried out, which is the largest surveying of coaches and coaching in the UK, that, you know, coaches are least likely to feel they have a good understanding of working with people with long-term illnesses or health conditions. And so, you know, 3 in 10 people feel they have no understanding of coaching people with long-term illness or health conditions. So I think, you know, personally, this is a kind of topic that's really, I'm quite passionate about this topic from a personal perspective, but I think my view in terms of inclusion and what that means has also evolved over the course of my life and my career and my experience as well. So it's fantastic to see, obviously, that inclusion and diversity are part of the duty to care, which is the industry led by UK Coaching, which is the response to the report and Taniguay's Thompson's duty of care report around the 5 pillars around the education and knowledge and support that we need to give to coaches to encourage them and to support them to be excellent coaches and be able to be inclusive and diverse. So it's brilliant to see that those elements are in there as part of that. But what I wanted to just, before I kind of go on to the next bit a little bit about my thoughts, is just to put in the chat box, and you have to bear with me because I just need to pull the chat box up there, is what's your take? What does inclusion mean to you? So if people want to share in the chat box, and I'm really sorry, I can't see my chat box anymore. Adam, sorry, would you mind reading some of those out?
I'll read out some of them for you as they come in, don't worry.
I have no idea where my chat box has gone, but thank you.
So from D, opportunities for everybody to take part. That seems very sensible. Being able to participate as me. I like that one, Ruth. Celebration of difference and equitable opportunities / resources from Emma. I think that's a very good one. Being able to thrive in sport, treating everyone as an individual and meeting their needs to take part regardless of what they are as a person-centered approach. Inclusion means coaches not making comments stating that they just stating outright comments. A safe environment free of judgment or stigma, feeling included and being part of things, being able to reach your potential regardless of disadvantage, removing barriers regardless of physical and other characteristics, equal opportunities for all, no judgment. I quite like that one. Not treating everybody the same, yes. Differentiated approach, having that individual approach. Yes, accessibility, so there is success for all. So athletes feeling that they can truly be themselves on and off the pitch, court or stadium. Like that, equal access. Yes. Any more for any more?
some brilliant ones coming out there. Thank you, everyone, and apologies that I can't see the chat box. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I suppose this is kind of how I've evolved as an individual and a person. I think firstly, inclusion meant to me as an individual, how to include me as a disabled person in sport and physical activity. And we know also that the term inclusion, we know from our own research, can sometimes put people off, or make people think that actually inclusion's not for me, because it is just about how we work with and include disabled people. But actually, as you're all pointing out there, it is a much bigger term about actually inclusion is something that absolutely resonates with everybody. And the other thing that comes out around inclusion, certainly early on, was it was about how to make something easier so that somebody could access it. And actually inclusion has two very opposite ends. So it is about how do we include people, but also then how do we challenge and keep challenging and keep supporting people to be the best that they can be. So yes, we want the person, the wallflower, the person that's not able to get involved or feel very supported, but we also want, in terms of inclusion, to make sure that we can tweak and we can change what we do in order to make sure that the people that are really whizzing along with things can really feel that they're still included, that they can still progress, that we can still challenge. So for me, inclusion is also about making sure that, again, you can thrive, you can challenge yourself, you can reach your potential, but all in a safe space. And it is really about feeling valued, supported, and listened to, and like actually what you're doing, I suppose, is making a difference. So in one of the athletics clubs I was involved in, I was asked if I would mind not travelling on the bus and leaving that seat to somebody else because they would put more points on the board than me. True. And I didn't actually get to know about that. That was a conversation that was had with my mum. And so for me, being able to compete for my athletics club and put points on their board, that was massively important, so that I felt included. And that's just one of my examples. But I think again, some of the tools and things that I became aware of from a very early age, in terms of not only the voluntary work that I did around working with people with severe impairments and boccia, in terms of looking at different activity models. So the activity inclusion model that we've got here now was adapted from the inclusion spectrum by Black and Stevenson, and this has been adapted and evolved by the UK Disability Sports Organisation's home country group. So again, some of the kind of really useful tools that I think sat in a disability sport world and was synonymous in a lot of way with a lot of the training and things that we were doing in a disability sport world. I think these are fantastic tools and things to share with all coaches around getting us to challenge and think about how we can be more inclusive in terms of what we're doing. And there's lots of different ways to use models like this. So I can even map my journey in sport as a whole through some of this. So I did sport-specific disability activities, I did open activities, I did modified activities in training. The whole way that I mapped my sport journey eventually could be kind of based around this model, as well as using this as an opportunity to think about, right, okay, how am I going to do this to include more people in my sport and physical activity session. So through the work that we're doing with the GC's Care module, one of the things that we're doing is to increase awareness of tools, resources, where to go to further advice in terms of helping coaches to adapt their sessions to make them more inclusive in the widest possible sense. So yes, these are very important when you're working with disabled people, but they're also very important for lots of different other ways as well. The other tool here that I love is something that I became aware of, again, more in a disability context and the sports ability bags from Youth Sport Trust back in the day. But again, something like the STEP model, again, I think is a brilliant tool that we can take out of the disability sport context and really look at, how do we use the STEP model as coaches, as clubs and as environments to really help to include a wider range of people in what we do. So there's practical tips in terms of coaching here, in terms of how I set my coaching activities and what I do, but also how I might approach things as a club. And as a setting, which means it's inclusive. So I think there's some really great tools here around being really inclusive in terms of helping coaches with their practice to be more inclusive, but also to think about things that they can do and general steps that they can take in order to make their environment and their setting more inclusive as well. And this is a tool that, as I say, we're working and very much promoting as a tool for all coaches to understand and get involved with, and really just use. So, to evolve our thinking in terms of how we might use this. So again, as a young disabled person, had experience of this, but very much from a disability sport background. But now, as I've evolved my thought processes, as I keep learning as a coach, as I keep working with different groups, and I'm working in mainstream sport again, this time as a parent helper in tennis, we see how great these tools are at helping coaches just be excellent coaches and help to make people feel included in that widest possible sense. So a real example of how we've all used the STEP model, even if we know it or we don't know it, as coaches and organisations, really, is because of the COVID-19 restrictions that have been placed on sport and physical activity. And so within this, we've all had to think about the widest possible sense of how we make our sport and our coaching and our activities inclusive, how we can put them on so that everybody can still access them given the restrictions that we have in place. And I think on a personal level, that's quite fascinating to look at actually what we've done as coaches, as sports, in terms of adapting our sport and physical activity and our sessions to make them as inclusive as possible. And that's for everybody, just in order to take part. So at a really kind of high granular level, this is just a tool that we've all, I think, become more familiar with using, whether we know it as that tool or not. So here's just an example, really, of some of the things that that my tennis coach has did, and I work with a brilliant lady now as an adult, recreational adult, just in sport and physical activity. And these are the examples of some of the things that she had to do with her group, the group of adults with men and women who are just completely recreational players. And this is kind of some of the things that she's done in order to help us get more involved and make sure that we can all still access at the very basic level, we can keep playing tennis. So I think that's just a real great example of how we're starting to use those more now, and it's great to see. And it's interesting because reflecting back, very often I don't tell people now when I go to sport and physical activity sessions that I've got a disability, and it's not an on purpose thing, and it never seems to come up in conversation. It never seems to matter. I think what matters more for me now is the fact that I'm a mum, or a parent, I should say, with two kids, and the fact that I've got a parent, that I'm a parent with two children, I think has more of an impact now on my ability to take part in sport and physical activity and what I can do than my cerebral palsy ever did. But it's just interesting now that as an adult, having retired from athletics and not being involved in any kind of formal sport for a long time, tennis is the sport that I've gone back to, and it's a very different experience for me moving forward. And I've found it, extremely inclusive, and the way that the lady organises it is fantastic. But I think it's just a real, to reflect back on this and kind of think there was a point in my life where having an impairment was a real barrier for me in terms of sport and physical activity. And part of that was my barrier, and part of that was the society around me. And now how easy it is for me to get involved. So I think that's just some of my reflections. And I think to finish with, some of the things that I've kind of thought about as we've gone along through using some of these tools is actually we need to understand why we use tools, why we want to use tools to adapt. And actually the key things there that are important are understanding motivation and personal goals. What do we observe? Why does a person want to come to our session? Is it about they want to be the best they can be? Is it about social? All those things are going to have an impact on how we as coaches adapt and change what we do and what we provide for people. And then when we use things, what is the effect of adaptation on competence, and individually and socially? And all those questions, although they're really important in terms of working with disabled people, aren't any different to any of the other questions that we might ask now that I'm a mum returning and I haven't done sport and physical activity for a long time. What are my motivations and what are my goals? And they were very different to the athlete that I was 20 years ago. And so that in itself changes the whole context of what we do. So I just find it fascinating that actually almost the tools that we're using here around inclusion can be used in its widest context. And I think that's probably my biggest learning point along the way. And that I'm just very fortunate that I work for an organisation where we can continue to provide tools and resources. And really just from my point of view, my wish is that we just continue to have that conversation with coaches around, how do we make things inclusive? What are our concerns? What could we do better? What can we share? What works well? Because I don't think anybody has the one answer. There's not an expert anywhere. But actually, if we work collectively, and more importantly, if we work with the person in front of us, we can really make a difference. And I've just put up some resources there that we will circulate afterwards. Apologies.
Yeah, no, we will definitely be circulating those next week. And Esther, thank you very much for a very detailed presentation. And we've just got some time for a few questions, if I may. I think one of the things that I think is fascinating as a human geographer turned sports researcher is the idea of lived experience coming into it. And I think you touched upon how coaches could potentially learn from their participants, but is there anything you would want to discuss in terms of those with disabilities coming into coaching more frequently, even within athletics, for maybe even able-bodied participants?
Sorry, so in terms of what?
Would you like to see more people that have engaged? So you've talked about your unique pathway into sort of the coaching realm in UK coaching now. Would you like to see more people with disabilities come into that realm, and even the realm of able-bodied, so that people were understanding of the challenges and how to engage other people?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, and I know it might sound a kind of bit strange, but for me as a young disabled person, there weren't many role models. And because I went to a mainstream school, the only kind of other disabled people I saw were things that I saw on television, or things that I, and more importantly, I guess things that I didn't see. So there wasn't, so Tanny Gray bless her, you know, really kicked off the revolution in terms of, you know, really the profile of disability sport. So, you know, when we were in Barcelona in '92, and it was the late Helen Rollason that really kind of took this mantle up. So yes, there was local press. I think it was on the teletext and local radio. But in terms of television, the coverage of Barcelona in '92 were 3 1-hour programs over the course of 3 weeks that were shown something like 2 weeks after the game. So it was almost like a documentary on what had happened, you know, and that's the kind of level of engagement that we got in engagement in publicity in terms of sport and physical activity. So, you know, and you've got to bear in mind that I'm talking about the early 90s here, but it, you know, when people say, you know, I talked about the fact that I'm a Paralympian, and they'd be like, that's nice, because nobody knew what it was. They didn't know what it meant. I know, but I can't remember how many times I'd been asked, you know, where's your wheelchair? Okay, well, not everybody competes in a wheelchair, do you know what I mean? But I think the limiting and the sparse coverage of disabled people, I mean, also in everyday life, I guess, but you know, that was a barrier in sport as well. And so I think it's fantastic. You know, I was there when the world class programs came on board, and we navigated our way through the world class programs coming in and integrating what was a really strong disability structure, but then also the world class programs picking those up, and then the impact of that on sport. You know, I think has been personally fantastic that we've got a huge amount of more coaches coming into working with disabled people, and I noticed that from an athletics point of view. You know, and that's what you want. You want really good people that, you know, at that level. You want people that understand the sport and want to take you forward as performers, because that's what that's what I wanted to be. So absolutely, I needed the best person. So yeah, I think there's definitely things around raising the profile. From a personal point of view, is that you know, I suppose when you don't see anybody like me, I very rarely see somebody like me, and I think it didn't stop me, because if it did stop me, I probably wouldn't, you know, I can't count the amount of times that I've walked into a room and kind of thought, well, I'm the only disabled person here, whether that's in my professional role or whether that's coaching or whether that's whatever. But I think I forgot the impact of, you know, seeing other people like me. And I know that's come out in lots of conversations that I've had with people that represent other groups and other individuals. It's important to see people like me in all walks of sport, you know, or people like yourselves.
Thank you very much. I think that there's something to touch upon in terms of a question here from Emma, and you sort of touched upon how we can have the best coaches coming in to develop athletes, as well as being able to be people-centric when applying to goals. What sort of advice, sort of on a very holistic level, would you give to coaches that might not be have a physical impairment themselves when approaching those sort of to transitioning to coaching those with physical disabilities or other forms of disabilities to be inclusive as possible?
I think nobody knows everything. Do you know what I mean? And I think, you know, I don't know everything about cerebral palsy at all, but I know about my cerebral palsy, and I know how it will affect me. So I think the thing is, as a coach, you don't have to know everything. Do you know what I mean? You don't have to feel that you're an expert about what I'm saying is you've got resources there in front of you. So if I go back to that point about that early conversation that I had with that coach, now in that the group of 3 of us, there was the sprints coach who had obviously technical knowledge and the knowledge of athletics that I was after. You had me that had knowledge of my disability and what I thought I could and couldn't do. And, you know, as a coach, I'm always going to challenge that a little bit, do you know what I mean? Because we want to help people move on. But we've also got, you know, the parents there. So I think between us, you know, what's really important for me, and, you know, I from a personal point of view, you know, I think we need to be really, I'm not expecting coaches to know everything straight away, but I think we really need to think about that first moment that we create. If I think about I know this is very personal, but you know, if I think about the other things that were going on in my life at the moment, you know, education wasn't great. You know, I did not want to go to that place. Do you know what I mean? It took me a lot of courage, and part of that was my own bias, because I'd experienced other negative things. I took that baggage with me as a person. I realise that now, that I went into this thinking, oh, it's going to be a nutmeg, you know. But I suppose what I'm saying is, if somebody plucks up the courage to go, as coaches, I personally feel we've got our responsibility to be as welcoming as we can, because we don't know how much, you know, difficulty in terms of, you know, even just physical locality of, you know, the club that I went to. I grew up in a really rural place. It was over 25 miles away, so it was a 45-minute journey to get there. So if I'd gone home again instead of walking across the track to the other place, I would never have gone back. So I think we need to think about, you know, if somebody turns up at your door, at your club, you know, how can we welcome them? How can we make them feel like, you know, yes, this is for you, even if you don't have all the answers. By all means, come along, have a look at what we do, and then we can then start to have an informed conversation. So it doesn't mean that you know, have to know all the answers straight away. It doesn't mean that you have to do something that you're not uncomfortable with, but actually just, you know, what would you want to feel? You just want to feel like this could be somewhere for me, because there might be other areas of your life where you're really struggling. Do you know what I mean? And that, you know, you don't leave that out the door and you don't have a different experience. Do you know what I mean? What happens in society affects you. And I personally believe, you know, if I look at, there might be a very good reason why I shouldn't be in the armed forces. I keep hold of that. Do you know what I mean? The guy said to me, someone like you is not suitable for the armed forces, and that will stay with me forever. But I personally believe that there might be barriers, there might be things that I can't do, but sport and physical activity, it isn't one of them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think I totally agree. I think probably our last question, I think it's quite an apt one, where you talked about trying stuff in physical education in schools, is do you think that from in terms of educationally there is any room for improvement in terms of getting those with any form of disability involved in physical education as a way of breaking down barriers? Because I think what you're talking about is some of the things that sport can facilitate some positivity when there might be a lot of negatives going on.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to hope that my experience of sport and physical activity in school is dated and not the same. Now, I'm not sure whether that's the case all the way, and I wouldn't like to comment on that. I do know that I went to the Activity Alliance conference a couple of years ago, and there was a lady who spoke who gave a very similar experience of getting involved in sport and physical activity at school, you know, 20 years after I did, and it hadn't kind of changed much. But I think, you know, there's a real opportunity. I think sport and physical activity is such a positive thing. You know, and I think it's more important, not more important. For me, it was vitally important where there were other avenues of my life that, for whatever reason, weren't inclusive and accessible. Whereas actually, you know, I've been able to thrive in sport and physical activity and in that sector, and not only through what I've done personally, but also, you know, in my career as well. But without that, without the coaches, without the people creating that environment, you know, I don't know where I wouldn't be here today. Do you know what I mean? So that's why I just think it for me, sport and physical activity ended up being an avenue that was opened when everything else seemed to be shutting.
I think we're just about out of time, so I'll leave. There's some questions in the Q&A, so if you fancy tackling some of those, I'll leave you to them in the Q&A. And on behalf of all of us at Team Athlete Z, I'd like to thank you very much for such a personal story, well presented, and gives a lot of us food for thought, I hope. And I'll hand over to Rosie Collins to introduce our next session.
Thanks, Nathan. And yeah, just to echo those comments, a fantastic presentation, and all done with homeschool going on in the background. So well done. Very, very impressive. So I'm really excited to introduce our next speaker. We've got Rebecca Foster, MBE. So Rebecca has been teaching PE predominantly in the north of England for over 20 years. She was the head of PE and for one of the first 6 sports colleges in the country. And after 7 years of teaching, I don't blame her for this, I'm very jealous, backpacked around the world and did some temporary teaching in Australia and the south of and South Africa. After the year out, Rebecca continued to teach in Yorkshire, managing one of the largest sports partnerships in the country, and then went on to become a teaching fellow at Leeds Beckett University, where she taught the initial teacher training programme for the secondary and primary trainees. Rebecca has competed for her country in heptathlon, although she says that that was a little while ago, but she also holds a level 2 multi-event licence. Rebecca's volunteered for the UK Deaf Athletics for 12 years, being team manager, and travelling as a coach at 3 Deaf Olympics as well. She's currently a trustee for Deaf Direct, which is based in Worcester, and is a support worker for a few hours a month to the vulnerable young people as well. But as a further accolade, Rebecca has been awarded an MBE in recognition for her services to inclusive sport and supporting young people to achieve their potential. So thank you so much for joining us, Rebecca, and looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, although I can't seem to see myself, but is that a problem?
No, we can't see you either, but as long as we've got your presentation, I'm sure we'll be fine.
Yeah, I'm busy trying to start my... Oh, well, here we go. And I'm now trying to share my screen. Where are we? Here we go. All right, okay.
That's great. We've got you and your screen now, Rebecca.
That's brilliant. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to look the other way because my screen is set up for this one and now it's on this one instead. So apologies. So anyway, this is going to be quite peculiar, so I'm not going to be looking directly at you. But hello, thank you, Rosie, and thank you very much, Adam, for inviting me to do this today. You've alluded to the fact, yes, I am a teacher, I've been an athlete, I've been a lecturer, I've done a bit of research as well. But also a shameless plug for me is that I'm course leader for the Masters in Adapted Sport, one of the first in the country. So if you're interested, please tweet me later. But as far as my positioning goes ahead is that I'm a bit of an insider and an outsider. So although I'm not disabled and I have my hearing, I could be deemed as an outsider. But actually, the deaf community really did embrace me regarding my interest in deaf sport. So I was able to really sort of get involved in the team. And as you'd said, Rosie, I've been with the team for over 12 years. So a bit like Esther, I was an athlete and I retired and wanted to give something back to sport. So I learned sign language and I developed my coaching skills, coupled that with my teaching skills. And then I sort of thrust myself into the deaf community, whether they wanted me or not. But they embraced me and I was their traveling coach and team manager for 3 consecutive years. 3 consecutive Deaf Olympics. But before I sort of launch into what Deaf Olympics is, I want to do a bit of a pop quiz. And again, because my screen is actually over there, I'm seeing nothing in front of me and I can't see the chat box. So if it's okay, Rosie, you could tell me. I'm going to ask the audience, and I just want a yes or a no, please. Can deaf athletes compete in the Paralympics?
We're getting lots of no's. No, they can't. And no.
Okay, well, that'll do for
and
me.
One yes.
Oh, good. I love crowd participation, so thank you very much. So the answer is no. If you're purely deaf, you can't compete in the Paralympics. But if you have a hearing impairment coupled with another impairment, such as cerebral palsy, you will be allowed to. So there's maybe a little bit of discrimination there. So my next question to the audience is, can every deaf person who's met, let's say, the athletic qualifying standard, can they enter in the Deaf Olympics? Is it a yes or is it a no?
Oh, you're taking this one's clearly a toughie. We've had one no so far, but a couple of question marks.
Oh,
A couple of yeses. Ian Braid, a man after our own heart, depends.
Yes, I am dividing the room on this, aren't I?
Yeah, very
so the answer that I'm going to give you is, the answer is no. People have, not every deaf person can automatically compete just because they hit the entry standard. They have to have a certain level of deafness, and that's 55 decibels in their better ear. So again, we're looking a little bit that it is exclusive, although we're trying to be inclusive. So my next question for the audience is, does every deaf athlete know and use British Sign Language?
You're getting a round robin no here, and an additional sort of honest point from someone saying, I was not aware there was a Deaf Olympics. Please do explain a bit more, which of course.
Well, glad you're here, whoever that is. So again, because of time, I'm going to say you are correct. Not every deaf person signs, is oral, has cochlear implants, has hearing aids. There is a completely whole host of different levels and continuum of deafness. So some people sadly still make the assumption that because you're deaf, you must know sign language, or I can't talk to you because you are deaf. So it's a bit of myth busting, but sorry, because you already knew that. My last question, and I'll get on to the nitty gritty. Do deaf athletes, are they allowed to wear their hearing aids at the Deaf Olympics when they're competing? Yes or no?
Gosh. We've had one yes so far, but all no's other than that. And again, a couple of question marks.
Okay. So again, thank you very much, Rosie, for your help. I'll come back to you one more time later on. But the answer to that is no, simply the athletes cannot compete with their hearing aids when they're competing. They have to remove them, give them to the coach or whoever. So I suppose what I'm trying to illustrate there for you is that we in a symposium today are supposed to be inclusive, but within our inclusive portfolio, we're excluding. So if you're not deaf enough, if you can't reach this particular standard, and if you don't remove your hearing aids, you're actually somewhat excluded. So my argument would be, you know, so desperately want us all to be inclusive, but we do exclude. And I suppose it's whether or not it's equitable throughout the competitions that I've been privy to. So as I mentioned before, I've been an athlete and I saw a level of engagement, of value of non-disabled sport. And when I was at the Deaf Olympics, I realized that this was very different and I couldn't quite understand it. And I wanted to investigate it further. So I suppose today is really based on my article that I wrote with Dr. Hayley Fitzgerald and Dr. Annette Stride, just to try and unpick as to why it is what it is at the moment, and can we do anything to change that? Just again, clicking on now. So these were the research aims that we looked at. And again, I'm going to have to look to the left to actually read them out to you. But what are the key factors that enable deaf athletes' involvement and progression in deaf sport? And what are the key challenges deaf athletes face when participating and progressing in deaf sport? So as I said, they were the two aims that we looked at. And we based our findings on an athletic development framework. Some would say it might be dated, but it is still quite effective in my eyes, is the Coat-and-Hay coach development framework. And we use that in some ways to understand people's relationships with why they stay in sport and maintain that or sometimes drop out. And we related that to deaf athletes all the way through. We also used the notion of deaf gain, which I'll kind of mention through as we go along, but it's the opposite of, you know, hearing loss is seen as a very negative word, but we're actually trying to flip that back to say, well, what do you gain by being deaf? And we kind of use that as a little bit of a thread through some of our findings. So only a very small research body was enabled, and they were from a range of disciplines, and they were interviewed at the very end of their competition. And I'm going to cut to the chase straight away to talk about the findings. So I apologise for that, but due to time. So we're looking at the sampling years of sports participation, and the first influence of sporting for deaf athletes was primarily their parents. So as many non-disabled parents are very supportive of their children, you know, they're often the kit washers, the nutritionists, the taxi, you know, they do everything. And it was similar within the deaf community, but it was only similar simply because the parents were aware of the deaf links. And what we have found that in hearing communities, very similar to what someone in the audience had said, didn't even know it existed. So as a result of that, there's an additional barrier. So the second influencer was PE teachers. Now, 3 out of the 4 athletes had said that they'd had very positive experiences. But David here had said that he actually had a very negative experience at school. But that didn't actually deter him from becoming a very high level athlete in the Deaf Olympics and also in mainstream. So he didn't put, that wasn't put off. But I suppose my advice for practitioners is to make sure that people are aware of these pathways, simply because if you tell one child, they might have extended family members or friends and aware of it to be actually spread that word a little bit more. So the second finding was discovering deaf sport. Now, for these athletes, a lot of their first experiences of sport was in a hearing space. So their deaf identity was very much challenged. Do I belong here? Should I be here? What's in this for me? I don't really understand the systems. So it wasn't until they showed ability that they then got sort of like headhunted a little bit by the deaf process. But other athletes were saying that they saw deaf articles, they saw other competitors and asked them about, I didn't realize that you were deaf, tell me how you got involved. And one athlete saw an advert on Facebook. She was 40 years old, saw the advert, managed to hit the entry standard for the Deaf Olympics and won a gold, a bronze medal, which is still pretty good going as far as I'm concerned. So Rav here was a deaf athlete, and he saw the article and said, I really belong in this space. And when I'm talking about deaf gain, Rav, when he was in competitions, of hearing competitions, because he was very focused on the mainstream competitions, because no one would talk to him because they were concerned about offending him. So he was very focused, but for deaf gain, of sort of straddling those two arenas of a hearing and a deaf world was a gain, because Rav then saw the amazing benefits that the Deaf Olympics and the deaf community gave to him. So the reason I put these images up is that this is at the Taipei Olympics in 2009, probably the best Deaf Olympics that's ever been and likely to be, because the country threw thousands of pounds. And as you can see with some of the pictures, the opening ceremony was phenomenal. The athletes finally felt as though they had arrived, literally. And this leads me on very nicely to my next point, which is the status and value of deaf sport. Now, just a pop quiz again for you, Rosie. Does anybody know, and for time again, I'll just say in Rio, for instance, does anybody know what the amount of money was given for the talent funding for Paralympics? Just as a guesstimate, and you can hit it with a million, you know, start with the millions. That's all I'm interested in.
So the nearest million.
Yeah.
Okay, Nicola thinks it might be 10, 17, 19, 5, 2, 1.
Okay.
Between 1 to 20 seems to be the consensus.
Okay, I'm going to backtrack. So 2012, the Paralympics were given 49 million, lots of pocket change as well, but 49 million. Rio, it grew to 71 million. Now, this is the big money. How much was the Deaf Olympics given?
Several people have written not enough. And we've now got 0, nothing, none, 1.
Okay, I wish it was even close to a million. It was £134,000. So thank you very much for playing, Rosie. Everyone's off the hook now, they can relax. So as you can see, the value in funding is already so very apparent. And as Karen says here, she felt as though she bought a national honours. She didn't earn it. And that pains me significantly. The media hype it was non-existent. The athletes felt that it was very short-lived, so it was very hip and happening when we were out there, and you know, BBC were getting involved. But as soon as we came home, we're expecting people to be walking through the airport with, you know, the high athlete. Absolutely, it was painfully quiet. So they feel that deaf sport is very, very invisible, and with that means that the attention towards their sponsorship is also effective because people don't know about it. Another issue is coaches. Coaches are non-disabled coaches in particular. We're telling their deaf athletes, you don't really want to be doing deaf sport. Focus all your energy on the mainstream sport, because you know that's you know, your hearing sort of thing. So again, that's sort of that straddling of two arenas of, am I hearing? What's my deaf identity like? What's my hearing identity like? Where do I belong? So all of that operates in the athlete's mind. And I'm also going to show you these lovely pictures because, again, as I said, a bit biased towards Type A, as you can see, but the athletes felt like absolute superstars. They had banners, billboards, massive billboards. They had flags on the taxis. They had just everything was geared up towards the athlete. And it's kind of the closest thing I think that a lot of the athletes will get to being superstars, which again pains me. And in a complete opposite of that, the opposite was one of the Olympics, not the Deaf Olympics, not so long ago, the athletes weren't allowed to use the mainstream arena. They were given the training track. So again, when the value is given on their supposed to be their mega event, confidence, etc., goes down. So I'm going to move on to my final slide, which is some top tips, hopefully, as to where or how this might inform your practice. And I put, you know, it's to develop inclusion in your corner, because, you know, it's a massive job to try and instigate and initiate change. This picture was actually from Melbourne, which they did a really good opening ceremony too, but anyway, that's not the point. So my quest would be to please try and raise a profile of the Paralympics and the Deaf Olympics, but also the Special Olympics, Dwarf National Games and World Games. All of these games are crucial and could make such a significant difference to the athletes. And I fear as though I'm probably preaching to the converted here because you're in this arena, but it's really for you to spread that word even wider. And it's the same in schools. You know, a lot of the trainee teachers that I come into contact with, I'm saying, tell the students about these pathways. We want you to challenge the notion that disabled sport is not a lesser sport. These people have actually competed and invested just as much time as the likes of Usain Bolt. I can't say so. And it's an unconscious bias that some people might have about, you know, that disability, it's not quite proper sport. So again, we want to try and challenge that mindset. And finally, we want to try and reposition the athlete because they've got nothing to lose by getting involved in deaf sport. You know, some of these coaches are saying, no, stick with this sport. This is the channel, because they know that. But the deaf gain that athletes get by going to the Deaf Olympics is just second to none. And I would qualify that, but I'm just conscious that I probably have overrun. So I will pause and just say, I can't see anything. So can I finish that point, Adam or Rosie? Sorry, there you are.
Please do finish your point, Rebecca.
Okay, thank you very much. So my point is that deaf gain. The first Deaf Olympics I went to, there was a young athlete, let's say she's 16 years old. She won gold medal, but she was born to hearing parents. And it was the first time she'd been exposed to the deaf community. And she absolutely loved it. 4 years later, she came back, full sign language, had been going into her schools and raising awareness of deaf awareness, and her confidence and deaf gain was absolutely huge. So these athletes have nothing to lose. And even if they're not athletes, look towards the deaf societies as well, because it can only enrich people's lives as far as I'm concerned. Thanks, Rosie. I'll button up now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And I mean, a lesson for all of us, I think, there with a lot to learn in your pop quiz. We've had a question from Jamie, and I'm not 100% sure if I've interpreted the question correctly, but Jamie would like to know if you think that deaf sport is the most undervalued opportunity to increase participation, not just disabled people's participation.
No, I think deaf sport is one of them. I would equally say that the dwarf sports are often ignored, as are Special Olympics. And many of these athletes have to find their own funding, as I said, Karen did, but it's the same, you know, and it epitomizes that piteous notion that non-disabled people have. Oh, bless them, let's give them some money to go, rather than, no, these athletes have achieved a great deal, let's support them and recognize the hard work that they've put into their sport.
Fantastic, yeah. And you've mentioned throughout your presentation just here a couple of other bodies that would sit within this environment of who do we include. And do you find that in your role within deaf sport that you find yourself having to advocate for lots of these other organisations, or is it simply a case that you try to keep to one and hope that that will increase for all?
No, I mean, this presentation was on about Deaf Olympics, but as a good practitioner, as a passionate practitioner, you got to shout out when you get the chance to. You know, it's a platform for me to just say, well, some might not have known about that. So an advocate for minority sports, particularly for disability, yes. But yes, my heart is obviously with deaf athletes, but again, I recognise the commonalities to what Esther was saying, and to any minority group trying to get a voice in sport.
Perhaps a bit more of a logistics question. You can help us all understand this a bit more. Daniel has asked if you know about the justification for deaf athletes not being allowed to compete in the Paralympics. Could you shed a bit more light on that for us?
Well, I've kind of been distracted by something is it Jamie, did you say?
Yes,
Jamie.
Jamie.
Yeah. So Jamie, I'm glad you've written the book, because I'm thinking, I bet someone's going to ask me that. So Stuart Harrison did write a very good book, which Jamie has put in there. And yes, I am aware of it, but there is some sort of, I don't know if we'll ever know the true story, because there's much of the deaf history of sport has never been written for various reasons. But actually, the Deaf Olympics started before the Paralympics. The Deaf Olympics started in 1924. So they were already somewhat established, and they were known as the Silent Games at the time. So the Paralympics all got together, all the other national governing bodies, and the Deaf Olympians were sort of saying, well, hang on a minute, we've got all of these activities that we're doing. You're saying that we can only do a few of them. So they kind of had that sort of discussion, and for whatever reason, they didn't come up quite with a compromise. So at that time, the Deaf Olympians decided to sort of stay away, and some might say, you know, that wasn't the best move, but others sort of say, you know, time has moved on. But again, that's probably another discussion.
Fantastic. Okay, well, Jamie's popped that to the panelists, so we can put that book on the main chat for everyone to see and check out.
All right, thank you.
And to maybe just synthesize a couple of questions, the one we just mentioned from Daniel and one we've here got from Andrew. Andrew was talking about obviously the BBC showing the footage from the Deaf Olympics, but then maybe not actually helping that spread, not helping to spread the awareness. What is your opinion of that? Is there something more you think that we maybe could be doing as a community?
It's $1 million question, really. I think, yes, we can all do our little bit in our corner, which is what I'm saying. But on a grander scale, I mean, the Sports Personality of the Year, I think only for the last 2 years have Deaf Olympics been mentioned. So again, when you think that, you know, we're quite developed now, sport or Deaf Olympics got a mention, but not necessarily a great deal of recognition. So yeah, I do think UK deaf sport do a very good role at trying to advocate awareness around deaf sport, but I think until closed captions are on TV, or people can access that more openly, and we have actually more of an inclusive media platform, we're still alienating a huge part of our population. So yeah, I think everybody could do more. How that might look wider than my little corner is pretty hard, pretty tough going. So sorry to not fully answer that, but I probably because I don't know.
Well, yeah, absolutely, and I'm sure, you know, every idea there would be so very many more. I'm really conscious of time, and moving on to the next presentation, and Leslie has actually offered a lot of information that maybe you can go back to answer when we're on to the next presentation. But just to take her last point, how can we better signpost at grassroots level? Is there something you think we could be doing right there at the entry?
Yeah, I think like Esther had actually said, don't turn anyone away. There's some athletes that go in and people say, oh, we don't know sign language. And it doesn't matter. You just need to have a smile, say, yeah, come and have a go, talk to that young person, because you can probably find that they've got some oral skills, and just be opening as if you would be for a non-disabled person. Try and be the same, because really, if you take away that lack of hearing, the child is predominantly the same.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for your insight and your quizzing, and yeah, helping us all to better understand another part
Thank you.
of activity and diversity. And we're going to hand over to Nathan now, who will introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Rosie, and again, thank you, Rebecca. I will apologise for my jab at Twitter at 20 years plus in teaching. I do apologise. That feedback did get back to me. Following on from that, I'd like to introduce our next panellist, Dr. Natalie Campbell from the University of Gloucestershire, where she is a senior lecturer, to talk to us about the ableism of elite sports services. Now, Natalie is a social psychologist and works at the intersection of wellbeing, sport, health and inclusion. She's become interested in sport and physical activity as a teenager, but had always been interested in learning about people and society, especially people who are thought of as different. A lot to unpack, so hopefully I will hand over to Natalie now to take us on that journey. Natalie, if you're there.
Yeah. Can everyone see me okay? Hear me okay?
We've got you now, and if you'd like to share your screen with us, and
yeah, I will do. Okay, it's just loading, waiting. Oh, I'm sharing already. Brilliant. Super. Yeah, so as you can clearly see, the title of my presentation. So I'm going to be talking to you about the ableism of elite sports support services. And what I want to start is that I'm fully acknowledging that the information that I provide over the next 15-20 minutes is not all practitioners, and it's not all NGBs, and it's not all of the time. But it is a lot of practitioners and a lot of NGBs a lot of the time. And so if we're thinking about, you know, that underlying message of who is it that we're going to include, this is sort of really more of a reflective piece that tries to join up where I have certainly seen the gaps working in elite sport of where we're kind of slowly missing the mark. And this is specifically around disability. Now, I'm using a different platform than PowerPoint. It's something that I use a lot with my students. It's called Menti. So it hasn't let me down so far in teaching, so hopefully it won't let me down today, but we'll see. So I've had an introduction, but whilst I talk a little bit more about myself, what I'd like you to do, if possible, is grab your phone or open up another tab and just type in your browser www.menti.com. So this is going to be quite an interactive presentation, and so this is why I use this platform. So if you can just do that on the side just whilst I talk about myself. So yeah, as Nathan says, I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Gloucestershire. I'm a chartered psychologist, primarily a social psychologist. Broadly, my area of work is the subjective health and wellbeing, and I tend to focus that on disability. So I'm a former performance lifestyle advisor for the English Institute of Sport, although interestingly, I didn't work with any para athletes, and that will sort of play into the narrative of what I discuss a little bit later. But I've been a Special Olympics volunteer sports coach for about 15 years now, maybe a little bit more. And I'm also a trustee at the Shamwell Centre, which is a new leisure facility developed specifically for disabled children within the area of Gloucestershire. So I'm researching within the space, working within the space, volunteering within the space. So hopefully that sort of gives me a little bit of legitimacy about why I'm going to be talking to you about the things that I'm going to talk about today. So before we start, hopefully if you go onto your Menti pages, you should see it asks you to enter a code. So if you could enter that code at the top of 5358015, you should hopefully see this question. And so just so I know the audience, who in the audience currently works with disabled athletes? So whether that's full-time, part-time or volunteering. I'm very aware that anytime I give a very generic presentation on disability, I kind of have to go with the angle that the majority of the individuals, unless I know that that's the point of the session, aren't working within the space. And so it just helps me to get that little bit of understanding. Okay, so we've got a majority who aren't currently working with disabled athletes, and that's quite, oh, we're still going. I'm conscious of time, so I might ask you to be sort of quick on your buzzers. Cool, okay, so we can say that the majority of the audience aren't currently working with disabled athletes. So thinking about that, if you were to go and work with a disabled athlete, if an athlete wants to know how an increase in their funding, so we've got a podium level athlete, a funded athlete, and they wanted to know how an increase in funding might affect their PIP, would you know how to help them? So if you were a coach or a psych or a biomechanist or whoever is working that area, and an athlete comes to you to say, I want to know if I win my next competition, it means my funding goes up, how is it going to affect my PIP? Would you know how to help them? We've got the honest answer of there, what's a PIP? So a PIP is a personal independent payment, and some of you might formally know it, understand it as disability support allowance that comes from the government. So that was rebranded a while ago. It's an awful form of assessment of ability, but it's called PIP. So something that happens that certainly para-athletes need to think about is if they get an increase in their funding because they win competitions, etc., it could ultimately affect how much money they get in support from their personal independent payment. Okay. Next question, if an athlete wanted a confidential conversation with you about boosting, would you know how to have that discussion? So a yes, a no, or a what the hell's boosting? Okay, we're getting there, So within the para space, more specifically within the area of spinal cord injury, boosting is it's a particular method of doping without taking any illegal drugs. And it's where athletes cause intentional pain or harm within particular areas of their body to cause a dramatic increase in blood pressure just before performance. There's an awful lot of physiology behind it. It's very frowned upon, but it's not illegal because it's very difficult to determine if an athlete has been doing it. But what I want to illustrate from those two examples is whether you're an undergrad, postgrad, and we'll come on to that in a second, or whether you've worked in the sporting area for a while, you will more than likely be aware of conversations around funding and how funding works for able-bodied athletes. But those conversations around funding for para-athletes are very minimal in terms of their discussion. Similarly, if we talk about doping and anti-doping, lots of education available for able-bodied athletes. Those conversations are lacking a lot for para-athletes. And so we really need to stop and question and think, okay, everything that I have learned, or what I think I have learned about elite sport, how much of it could I actually apply to a para-athlete if I was to go work with a para-sport tomorrow? So I'm going to do just a tiny bit of an academic bit because that's sort of, part of the conference, but I want to delve a little bit more deeper into sort of the more practical and practitioner side of it. So a little bit of the academic bit. So the work that I do within disability studies, the academic angle of it. It's called Critical Disability Studies, and it's a subset of sociology. And without going into too much detail, if anyone wants more information, I can certainly give you some. There's lots of different models that exist within the critical disability studies landscape to attempt to theorize, and I use that word quite loosely, attempt to theorize the phenomenon that is like disability, this one big thing that sort of everything gets lumped in together. So you may not have heard of the medical model of disability or the social model of disability. There's also the social relational model of disability, there's the psycho-emotional model of disability, there's the religious model of disability, the humanistic model of disability. So there's, for a long time, sociologists have been trying to understand this concept of disability. And you can see I've sort of highlighted there, disability in itself, which we've heard from our two previous speakers, is uniquely individual. So it's very, very difficult to try and go from the minutiae of one person's lived experience to trying to understand it for every single person across the whole world who self-identifies as a disabled person, but it is globally experienced. So we've got the broad and the parochial and everything in between. And certainly what I need to say up front, working within this space, and I do it all the time, and I do it in my papers and presentations, and when I'm working with individuals, I am a non-disabled person who is working within the space of Paralympic sport. And so I need to recognise that I occupy a space within elite sport that somebody with a disability is being denied the opportunity to work within that space. So there's been a little bit of this discussion already around insider-outsider roles, which I think is a really important reflection to bring forward. So if you're a heterosexual person working within a non-heterosexual space, if you are a white person working within a non-white space, etc., etc. It's a really important thing to be able to grasp. So when I discuss what it is I'm going to discuss with you, I'm coming at it knowing very much that yeah, I am a non-disabled person. So I was thinking, okay, how can I squish everything that I want to say into 15 minutes to sort of really highlight what I term the ableism of the elite sports services? And I thought, well, most practitioners will come through an undergraduate route. And with that undergraduate route, it might be purely their degree, or they might have done some workshops, training on the side, etc., etc. But most practitioners, not all, but most practitioners will come through sort of one of these typical degrees. So you might have done sport and exercise sciences, we've got some strength and conditioning, some pure sports psychology degrees, sports therapy, physiotherapy, sports coaching, etc., etc. And through doing those degrees, certainly my experience, and I'll ask you for your experiences, from the universities that I've worked at, disability tends to be, certainly within these courses, if it's even thought of at all, a very tokenistic approach is used. And so there might be a lesson on disability, a lesson on the Paralympics, a lesson on special populations. Very rarely will you have modules completely dedicated to disability sport or adapted physical activity. And if you do, more often than not, those modules are optional. So you might have a student that is interested in it for whatever reason and will choose to take it, but you can have a whole load of undergraduates and postgraduates come out where they've never even touched the sides of anything to do with even the foundational understandings of disability. And one of the issues with that is that a lot of undergraduate and postgraduate degrees are accredited to professional bodies. So the UK SEA, for example, for strength and conditioning, BASRAT for sports therapy, BASES or the BPS for sports psychology. And these tend to be the essential requirements for a practitioner working in elite sports. So they need to be accredited to these professional governing bodies. Now, hopefully I'm joining the dots for you. What you could see is you could have someone that comes out with an undergraduate degree or a postgraduate degree in strength and conditioning and is accredited to the UK SEA and has never had any introductional considerations of what it is like to work with a disabled athlete. And yet that individual has the minimum qualifications required to apply to work with such athletes. And so when you start to dig a little bit deeper into the professional standards of these accredited bodies, which are what the elite NGB standards are looking for, you know, UKSA, for example, it has no para-specific workshop. So not only is it not included in part of the professional standards to become accredited, currently they don't even offer, you know, a workshop for you to go on and learn about disability and different movement for different disabilities. For psychology, if you look at the benchmark standards, there's nothing there about working with special populations within sport and exercise psychology. So that's different if you're looking at counselling psychology. But for sport and exercise psychology, there's nothing there in the professional standards. So you could have someone that qualifies as an HPCP registered sports psychologist. Their first job is with para athletes, and you'd like to hope they might have done some due diligence beforehand, but they might not have, about even understanding the basics of the psychological impact of acquiring a disability at a particular age and what that disability was, etc., etc. And also quite often, everything in terms of education and training is kind of lumped together as disability. So, you know, there might be disability awareness workshops and disability awareness certificates, but if we're looking to gain that 1%, you know, our marginal gains in the elite side of things, why is it that as yet there is not appropriate training and qualifications for all of the different paraspecific disciplines that exist within all of the different sports? So I'd just like to know if I'm talking nonsense, and I said it from my experience and the different degrees I've taught on, the different degrees universities that I've worked at, that's certainly been the case. So if you are an undergraduate or a postgraduate, I should have put that in the question, I'd like to know, does that sound like your experience? Okay, so we've got higher levels there of it being not applicable to you. So for me, that's really interesting. I'd really like to find out who these people are and what your pathway was, especially if you are a practitioner. And it might be that you didn't do any of the degrees that I mentioned, but certainly it's something that it causes me concern when we're sort of revalidating degrees and looking at course maps at the moment. How can we influence professional practice through higher education to ensure that when practitioners come through from their formal education and are accredited by these professional bodies, to ensure that they have some standard of knowledge and understanding of working with disabled athletes? So an example of that, a little pop quiz. So there's 4 parasports at the bottom. So we've got wheelchair rugby, wheelchair basketball, wheelchair fencing, and wheelchair racing. Which of these is the only one to have a UKCC level 2 coaching qualification? So they're all parasports, national and international level athletes. Okay, good. Yeah, so if you put wheelchair basketball, you're correct. So out of those 4 Paralympic sports where athletes are expected to perform on an international stage, only one of them has a UKCC level 2 coaching qualification. And like wheelchair basketball is in developments, has been in developments for quite a while, of creating a wheelchair basketball. I've said it wrong. Wheelchair rugby is the only one that has the UKCC level 2. So wheelchair rugby is the only one that has the qualification. Wheelchair basketball is working on their level 1 and 2 qualification. It's in the making, but it's not there. Wheelchair fencing, there is a workshop that you can do on, but there's no assessments or evidence gathering of practice, etc., etc. Wheelchair racing is sort of lumped into the UK Athletics 1 and 2 qualification for able-bodied athletes as well. There's no specific coaching qualifications attached to it. And some of you may not know, so there's a new sport that's come out called frame running, and that is going to be included in the Paris 2024 Games, so 3 years' time. And a coaching qualification for that doesn't even exist at the moment. And so we need to think, why is it that we've got levels 1, 2, 3, and 4 in so many able-bodied sports, and it is an expectation to hold at least the level 3 in those qualifications to coach at national and international level, but para athletes are expected to be coached by someone who can have hardly any assessed evidence-based qualifications. Whether you need the qualification to be a good coach is a different argument. We don't have time for that today, but it's just sort of highlighting, as I said, sort of the ableism that exists. Now, I've pulled up, hopefully you can see them, they're a bit blurry, sorry. I've pulled up 2 very recent job descriptions. So the one on the left is for sport of, and the job description is head of para performance position. And if you look at the qualifications, a graduate level qualification in sports science, etc., we've already discussed that you could go through your undergraduate and not touch the sides in anything to do with disability, and any UKCC recognised coaching qualification. So I won't say what this sport is, but you could have your UKCC in, I don't know, basketball, but this might be the head of para performance for sled hockey. And the equivalent isn't there. On the right-hand side, we've got a vacancy for head para coach, a UKCC level 3 coaching qualification in, okay, canoeing, I've given it away, or another sport. Now, you wouldn't, for an able-bodied sport, you wouldn't see a vacancy for a head coach position where they would accept a UKCC level 3 qualification from another sport to be the head coach of a completely different sport. And so there's lots of research that sort of looks at how what is happening even at the elite level for coaching is there's just sort of lots of trial and error and copy paste type coaching that is going, and lots of on-the-job learning that is okay for a para athlete, but that kind of lack of depth of understanding of the technical and the tactical requirements of the sport wouldn't be accepted for the able-bodied sports. So it's just sort of highlighting these discrepancies between them. And I just want to finish by giving you some contemporary examples. So when I was working within the EIS, these are just 3 examples that happened. And I really want to stress these examples are not anyone's fault. They are not down to the discrimination or the lack of from a particular person. These are conversations that were happening quite a lot. And these, because of my working in the area, these conversations tended to land on my lap as, can you help me? Because individuals were in positions where they hadn't been exposed to the necessary knowledge and understanding of disability before being given positions within whatever position that might be. So a really practical example is funding. So we've already had the conversation where parasports get an awful lot less funding than the able-bodied sports. And every 4 years, an NGB has to put forward a business case for why it can have the funding for the next Olympic and Paralympic cycle. Now, within that funding, very, very few performance directors and team managers prioritize the need for some para athletes to have personal assistance with them when they go on, especially international training camps and competitions. And so whilst there is a legitimate, realistic need to understand the proportions of funding, where we're going to put our money and how we're going to spend it, there's a significant lack of understanding of the physiological and the psychological burdens that para athletes face if they are expected to travel internationally without having the support of a personal assistant, which is certainly for the athletes with higher level impairments is something that they will have in their day-to-day lives. And so a lot of the time athletes are faced with the challenge of either needing to raise the funds themselves or rely on, as we say, donated talent of an able-bodied individual to pay for their flights, their accommodation, their foods, their accreditation, etc., to go with them so that the individual can actually train and compete, or they have to take on that physiological and psychological burden themselves, which can have a detrimental effect to their physical performances and their psychological well-being. And that's something that is not at all understood, even if we're just talking at the very purest form of working out the logistics of how to get a athlete from A to B. Another really, it's still contemporary, I think, because it's still being discussed quite a lot. So if you cast your mind back to 2016, and you remember there was the controversy around the Zika virus for the Rio Games, and there was lots of outrage, lots of stuff in the news about Olympians are going to boycott and it's not safe for us to go. And internal conversations were happening with able-bodied athletes and members of staff around the fear of going. And if you unpack that fear is that the worst possible outcome is that an individual may give birth to a disabled child. So if you are a para-athlete and you are operating within a space, especially within NGBs, for example, like swimming or rowing, athletics, where the sports are together under one NGB umbrella, they're not separated, like basketball and wheelchair basketball are separate NGBs. There was a complete lack of awareness and understanding and sensitivity of how and when these discussions were being had. And so when there were central communications going out from lots of different sports organisations, so the British Olympic Association, the British Paralympic Association, NGBs wanting to have discussions with staff around their fears or concerns of going, I said there was no consideration in terms of what were those levels of conversations happening for the people that heard them, and especially the disabled athletes, and that caused quite a lot of tension and upset, certainly between some staff-athlete relationships and some athlete-athlete relationships, and it was never something that was addressed. It was never something that was openly addressed in the media, but it was a very prominent and pertinent, very salient example of how there is all this discourse and dialogue around inclusion, but only if that is in an elite sport setting. I'm happy to coach a disabled athlete, but I don't want a disabled child myself. And then the third sort of contemporary example, I'm really aware of time, that I want to discuss is how athlete activism has been in the spotlight for its gathering pace now over quite a few years. And I think sort of a very recent example is when the Sochi Games were going to be held in Russia because of their anti-gay laws. There was lots of, again, discussions around boycotting the games, and there was lots of solidarity from heterosexual and non-heterosexual athletes about the discrimination that was happening. Now, we don't see this level of activism being afforded to parasports. And so if we think when para competitions are going to be held, and that's international para competitions going to be held in countries that have very poor human rights laws, or they have very poor equality laws, and there are deeply embedded cultural considerations of a disabled person and the disabled body, it's not widely acknowledged that the conversations need to be had, potentially need to be had with the athletes, especially younger athletes that are coming through that perhaps haven't been exposed to that, of very much understanding that there is a very high chance that if that athlete is in that country, they may be susceptible to feelings of discrimination and discomfort and humiliation. Something that the athlete has to constantly contend with. Is this a situation that they want to put themselves in? Which is very rarely the case for an able-bodied athlete. And so going forward as a practitioner, whatever space you occupy, it's very important to understand that these are things that are going on in the background for para-athletes, and they may or may not come to choose to openly have those discussions. But when I talk about recommendations in a minute, I'll talk about how it's really important for you to present knowing that you are aware that this is something that the athlete is having to deal with. And so sort of moving forward, like as I said, it's not all the practitioners in all the sports all the time, and it's not singling out one particular person, but the ableism within elite sport is long-standing and it's deeply rooted, and there are political and cultural systems at work that will take an awful long time to be changed. But slowly the change is happening, but it only happens through activism and advocacy and highlighting things like this, the examples that I'm bringing to you now. So I ask sort of whatever space you do occupy, whether it's you're a volunteer or you're a coach or you're thinking of working in one of the practitioner spaces of physiology, nutrition, biomechanics, strength conditioning, etc., it's really important that you take the time to reflect on your own ableist practice prejudices, because you will have them, and it's just something to acknowledge and own and try and work on. And certainly what I have learned from working within the space for a number of years is that just presenting small gestures that demonstrate your awareness of particular situations and the empathy that you have with the individual about particular situations you might that they might find themselves in can really help to strengthen the athlete-practitioner relationship, which in elite sport ultimately will end with a better performance. And I'm done.
Thank you very much, Natalie.
Sorry, I think I took full advantage of the 25 minutes.
Yes, so unfortunately we're going to have to move question and answers into the Q&A boxes.
No worries, I'll hang around.
That's fine. And thank you very much for a really insightful insight into professional sports and some of the aspects that may need to change. I'm conscious we apparently SIMSA will be looking for professional standards across the sector. So thank you for Vinny Webb for pointing that out in the chat box. So I will hand over at this moment to Rosie Collins to introduce our next session.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Natalie. And 25 minutes is never enough to discuss such a big topic. So well done. And we're moving on to our next speaker, Bonnie, who I'm really, really excited to introduce, having seen Bonnie through from her undergraduate and now watching her in her PhD studies as well. So Bonnie's a postgraduate researcher studying with us here at Oxford Brookes University, where she's currently writing her PhD under the supervision of Dr. Adam White, Dr. Stuart Wigham and Dr. Peter Wright. And her research is focused on understanding anti-Semitism in the sporting context. And that's what she's here to discuss with us today. So thank you so much for joining us, Bonnie. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone at Brookes, especially Adam, who's worked really hard to make this happen today. So I just share my screen with you. Can everyone see that?
We can, yeah.
Great. So yes, as mentioned by Rosie, I am going to be talking about anti-Semitism in British football. So I did start looking into this for my undergrad and MRes at Winchester. And I'm lucky to be going in deeper for my PhD at Brookes. So just to give you a bit of background on myself, I was raised by a Jewish mother but a Christian father, and because of this I've sort of been open to a lot of religions in my life and sort of have experienced both the Jewish and Christian religion. My grandfather was actually a vicar, and so therefore my grandma devoted a lot of time to the church, and then my other side of the family are very passionate about their religion and Judaism, so therefore like I've been lucky enough to have been brought up to celebrate Jewish holidays, Christian holidays. However, if I was asked today, I would say I don't follow a religion. I'm just really proud of sort of my upbringing around both religions. So yes, so I just wanted to start with this quote that was taken from the Equality and Human Rights Commission report regarding anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, which is obviously quite prevalent in the media at the moment. But it's just a quote that sort of highlights that within Britain we are made up of lots of different people from different communities with a lot of different backgrounds, and we are living side by side. However, although we have different opinions that we're entitled to and different rights, we should sort of learn to have like this mutual understanding and respect. And I think I just wanted to start with this quote today because I think it really sort of summarises what we're sort of here to talk about, that we are all different, that we sort of all deserve the same understanding and respect. So I just wanted to start with that. But in short, anti-Semitism is the suspicion, dislike and hatred of Jewish individuals or groups. Unfortunately, it's a global phenomenon with 26% of the world's population admitting that they hold anti-Semitic views. Focusing on Britain alone, 25% of people would admit that they hold anti-Semitic attitudes as well. Anti-Semitic attitudes can include, but isn't limited to, claims of Jewish conspiracy, wealth, power, and Holocaust denial. Within the EU, 89% of the Jewish population felt anti-Semitism has increased over the past 5 years, and 85% believe that it's a serious problem. When looking at this in the UK alone, 75% of people believe that it's a big problem within the UK, and that 88% of people believe that in the last 5 years, they think that anti-Semitism has been on a rise. So this sort of highlights that it is sort of prevalent in society and that something needs to be done. But in regards to sport specifically, these are a range of comments that can be heard at football matches. So as you can see, these distasteful comments make reference to Hitler and Nazi Germany, whereby 6 million Jews were killed. They also mention this race hate word, yid, which you may be able to see, and many stereotypical like racial stereotypes that have been made about Jews. Obviously, with football being such a global phenomenon, like hearing these terms at football matches can really have such a big impact. So I wanted to do something, and that's where my interest comes in, is that I want to ensure that people of the Jewish community and also other spectators feel happy and welcome within society and sport specifically. So that's where I think there is a need for research. So just to talk to you a bit about my research. My first project that I'll talk about is Get Yeared Anti-Semitic Abuse at Tottenham Hotspur Matches, which I did for my undergrad. Then I looked into Elias's figurational theory, which explored the relationship between sport and religion, also focusing on Tottenham and Judaism. And then my PhD project, which will be examining good practice of anti-discrimination or educational initiatives and applying it to anti-Semitism within football. So as mentioned before, 2 pieces of my research have looked into Tottenham Hotspur. So Tottenham have been recognised as a Jewish club and have been associated with the Jewish faith. And this is for quite a multitude of factors. So firstly, proximity and location is one of the key reasons why people associate Tottenham with the Jewish faith. And this is because in the 20th century, a lot of Eastern European Jews who were escaping Russia to come to Britain would settle in the East End. This was because Tottenham had like quite a large area of like unskilled work and on the industrial side. So the Russians that were sort of trying to find a place to make home would settle there because they were able to find jobs. In regards to how this connects to Tottenham would be that the Jewish people on the day of the Sabbath, the day of the rest, they're forbidden to do, I think it's 39 activities, and one of these being lighting a fire. So if a Jewish person were to get in a car or a mode of transport, they would be essentially lighting an internal combustion engine, which would burn. So essentially they'd be lighting a fire, which would be forbidden. So therefore Jews were able to go to synagogue in the morning, and then they'd be within local proximity of the ground to just be able to walk there and not sort of break the rules of the Sabbath. So that's why and they have a large proportion of Jewish fans. Likewise, the current and previous chairmen and owners have been Jewish, and also the use of this Y word, which I'll speak about a bit later. But consequently, as a result of being connected to the Jewish club, the Jewish faith, and being named a Jewish club, they are targets of anti-Semitic hate. So this Y word that I mentioned of, the term Yid, originally means Jew, which emerged from the Ashkenazi Jews, which are the Eastern European Jews. And it was used as a sort of a term of endearment and familiarity. So they would use the term to sort of recognize one another and say, you know, sort of like a hello. But the Nazis abbreviated it and put intensifiers in front of them to sort of make them derogatory terms. So they may have said, you know, dirty Yid to make it a derogatory term. And since then, it's sort of been considered a race hate word and can be considered just as disrespectful as the N and P word, which we may also hear in society. But at matches, opposing fans would start to use it as a form of anti-Semitic hate towards Tottenham, chanting the Y word and other terms that you did see before on the previous slides. So therefore, Tottenham supporters thought that it'd be best to reclaim this word and call themselves the Yid Army and sort of deflect the anti-Semitic abuse that they were receiving. However, although it fills them with a sense of pride and endearment, they have been questioned by members of the Jewish community and other people who may not support Tottenham as to why they use the term, and it sort of caused quite a lot of controversy, and they've been asked by the World Jewish Congress, the Board of Deputies, the Community Security Trust, and other Jewish charities to sort of stop using it. But it still today remains sort of like a controversial debate as to whether they should use it or not. So this is where my first bit of research and my first bit of interest came in. And so I wanted to explore the attitudes and opinions held by Jewish Spurs fans to see whether they think that they should be allowed to use the Y word. So as it was just a small undergraduate project, I gained 6 Jewish male football supporters who attended Tottenham matches regularly. I wanted to ask them whether they thought they should be able to use the term, whether they sort of witnessed any anti-Semitic abuse, and just their opinions surrounding the word. Whereby I found that 50% thought that they should use the term Yid and 50 said no. As I mentioned before, it is a rather small sample, so it is hard to go by, but I did use a large sample in my next bit of research that I'll talk about. But from the data, 4 themes emerged, and these 4 themes were education, context, pride, and stereotypes. So I found that people mentioned that do Spurs fans really know what the term means and what it's implying? Like, do they know what they're shouting? So they believed that people needed to be educated on what the term meant and how it could actually be causing offence to others. Then there was people who were sort of like pro using it, saying, well, it depends what the context is. If Yid is graffitied next to a swastika, that's very different to it being graffitied next to the Spurs logo of a cockerel. They also highlighted, as mentioned before, from Polton's research, that that is like used as a term of pride and endearment. They wear it as a badge of honour. So when Spurs sing the word, it's being done as a badge of honour. It's sort of nullifying the hate word, and it's being used in a sign of pride. However, I did speak to some of the participants who thought they recognise, yes, it's being used as a sign of pride, and they recognise why they're doing it. However, could they just not use the race hate word? I know Ajax in Amsterdam, they also have this association, and they call themselves, I've gone off my head, but they have a more non-race hate word. It's more of a pride name. I think it's Jew team or something. I can't remember what it is, but they use a different term to sort of show their sense of pride. So could Tottenham not do the same? And then lastly, people also had like stereotypes aimed towards them because they were Tottenham fans. So someone here said, you must be good with your money because you're a Yid. So they're saying, because you're a Tottenham fan, that makes you a Yid, which means that you're good with your money, which most people may know that is a racial stereotype about Jews. They're all good with their money. So this took me on to my MRes research, whereby I used Elias's figurational theory to look at the relationship between sport and religion, focusing once again on Tottenham and Judaism. So Elias's theory explores individuals and the society that they're in. So for this project, I wanted to look at the society being Tottenham and the individuals that were in it. So I wanted to explore the attitudes and opinions of Tottenham Hotspur fans regarding their publicised connection to the Jewish faith. I really wanted to gain a larger sample of Tottenham supporters from my previous research, and I was really happy to get just under 600 respondents and 100 people, over 100 people willing to do extra interviews, but I only took 10. But from this research, I just wanted to see what people thought about whether Tottenham really are a Jewish club and sort of how they feel about it. So I did ask the fans, what 3 words would you describe to be a Tottenham supporter? Although there is amongst many negative words like frustrating, painful, heartbreaking, there are some words that really stood out to me. So you can see there is Yid and Yido, which from my previous research, which was obviously 50 said yes and 50% said no, this research found that 65% of participants said they should use it and 35% said no. But amongst these terms were pride or proud, community and family. So this made up some of my key findings. So firstly, linking also back to previous research, they were proud in the club, and specifically here, they were proud of the Jewish faith. So I looked into Elias's theory as insiders and outsiders concept, and they established that the Jewish people being considered outsiders in society as a whole, when it comes to Tottenham, they were insiders. They were brought into a community whereby they were accepted. And people were saying they're very proud to identify with the victimized group. They're proud of the club's Jewish heritage. I speak to people who aren't Jewish and they say to me, oh yeah, I'm Jewish too, because I support Spurs. They aren't Jewish, but when it comes to Spurs, they recognize like the pride in supporting the Jewish people and its history and its heritage. They also recognize that sport and religion have its similarities. So people sort of recognize that, you know, when you go to a religious building, so you may go to a church or a synagogue, and they sort of recognize the similarities of that to a stadium. So you go to a place to sort of worship a god, whether it be Allah or whichever god that you worship. But some people may go to a religious building to worship a god, whether it be Harry Kane or whoever you consider to be a god within football. They also recognise that, you know, you go to these places to sing hymns or to chant songs, and that you can be recognised as your fellow religion or your fellow club by what you wear. So whether it be, you know, the logo from your club or a kippah or a hijab, they sort of make your identity known. So they recognise similarities between sport and religion. And although 56% of fans did associate Tottenham with the Jewish faith, 44 did not. So they highlighted that there is no official confirmation, so they don't see why people associate them with the Jewish faith. However, it is all like publicised. There is, in fact, only 5% of fans who have sort of said that they are Jewish and Tottenham supporters, and this is going from Tottenham's research. So 5% being quite a small amount, people do question why there is this publicised perception. And then my last theme from looking at Elias's theory and using his personal pronoun model was that people would say we a lot, and they would say we are a family, we are a collective, and would use these terms that sort of imply that they're a group, which people who follow religions might also say, and that they're part of a group. But they really sort of like signified this whole like sense of community, and just by the use of the language, you could really see that regardless of who is in their team, they are a family, they are a collective and a tribe. So this brings me on to my PhD project, whereby I sort of want to, from my 2 pieces of research, key themes have sort of been like, people need to be educated. So for me, I want to do this project and try and make a change. So for me, I want to examine good practice in other anti-discrimination educational initiatives and sort of apply this to anti-Semitism within football, and be able to sort of like make a change and yeah, hopefully. So what I want to do is I want to have 10 to 15 semi-structured interviews with employees of organisations who have worked to tackle discriminatory behaviours within sport and society. So I would like to speak to people and sort of identify what good practice is, and apply this to anti-Semitism. And then from this, I hope to make a successful initiative that can be used to decrease anti-Semitic behaviour in football. Then I would like to trial it on the anti-discrimination experts to see what they think of it, get any more feedback, and see if I can make any changes to make it the best it could be. And then do a range of focus groups on club representatives, and then 4 London clubs, including Tottenham, to see what their perspective is on the initiative and see what their feedback is, and whether they think it would work, whether they'd be happy to use it, or even if they don't think it would work, and what their feedback would be, to then create a final initiative which will then be shared amongst football clubs if they would like. So yes, thank you very much for listening today, and if there is anyone who would like to connect or would like to take part in my research, whether they be a discrimination expert or a club representative or fan, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bonnie, for giving us a little bit of information about your research and such an important topic. We don't have any time for questions, I'm afraid, but as Bonnie said, please do connect with her if you've got queries, questions, or you would like to contribute to this really important topic. But I'm going to hand over to Nathan for our final speaker, to introduce our final speaker of the day. So thanks again, Bonnie.
Can I echo those thanks from myself as well, Bonnie? Really well done. And it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our last but no means least session for our second symposium, exploring the impact of social class on educational opportunities and the experience of undergraduate sports students, undertaken by Michael Hobson. I'd like to welcome Michael from the University of St Mary's University, should I say, where he is a senior lecturer in physical education, sport and youth development. He has an interest in sociology of sport and education with a specific focus on social class and race. And if Michael is there, I'll hand over to Michael.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being here. I'm just trying to share my screen. You can let me know if you can see that. That would be great.
I will do.
Okay, so yeah, I'm just sharing my screen now. Yep, can we see that?
Yes, we can.
All right, fantastic. Okay, so thank you. First of all, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone for sticking around. I know some of you would have been here for a while, and I really appreciate that. So any questions you've got, again, just pop them in the chat box. Hopefully we'll have time to talk through those. And I hope you're all having a good day. I hope you're all doing as well as you can be right now. I'm sure that you being here watching me may be procrastination from something else, but thank you anyway. So thank you for the introduction, Nathan. In terms of me and discussing my background, this topic is my PhD question, okay? And it really is focusing on trying to understand this intersection of social class and educational opportunity. Now, in terms of a bit of background to that, I work at St Mary's University, and one of the things that we sort of started to notice as we've been doing research is there's a particular group of students that seem to drop out, particular group of students that seem to not do so well, particular group of students whose attainment levels seem to be lower. And once I started this PhD project, I started to look in around this topic area and wanted to try and make sense of what was going on. So when I started doing the research, I eventually came up with these aims, okay? So based upon the research, what we found was that from the literature review, from looking out there, students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, from lower social classes had lower levels of attainment. They reported lower levels of senses of belonging at university. And they didn't necessarily always seem to feel like it was a space for them in the same way that students from higher socioeconomic backgrounds had traditionally. Now, that was what the research was saying. Now, working in sport, I was really interested around this because one of the things that became quite prevalent to me was some of the research in sport actually says that we had some of these subconscious biases as teachers or subconscious biases as coaches in relation to ability. And so when I started off with this question, it wasn't just about social class, it was also looking at ability and what's the intersection. So does sort of students who are high ability at sport, does that then nullify that link? Does that then make a change, if you like? So these were sort of questions that I had when I came into it. Now, when I move on in a minute, I'm going to define social class because I think it's a very vague term, and it's a term which isn't necessarily clear for us in the UK as well. And I just want to go into that a little bit. But these were my three main factors. So what is it about the student's journey prior to university? How did that shape their sense of belonging? How did that shape their experience of the course? And how have the behaviours and the characteristics they developed based upon their participation in sport, attending school, their family as a result of their social class, influenced their experience. Now, I've put this speech bubble here where I said it's about roots as opposed to roots. And that comes back to my discussion of defining social class, this notion of the route which we take, okay, as opposed to our roots, as in our heritage. And I think that's really important when we I built this upon sort of some of Stuart Hall's thinking about our ideas around identity, that our identity is very much shaped about the roots that, you know, the institutions we're involved in, the messages we receive about our identity, the organizations which we take part in, the media, all of these organizations shape our sense of where we belong, where we feel we can take part, where we feel like maybe it's not a place for us. So this was sort of my starting point. And in terms of trying to understand the study, as I said, the research sort of suggested there was this difference in participation, belonging, this sense of grades, this sense of going on to teach and be successful in teaching or be successful in sport. And one of the things that I had kind of noticed, I guess, going back to that, and it doesn't necessarily reflect this right now, but some of the students who got on to postgraduate study or who seem to be doing really well on the course, they seem to sort of carry themselves in a similar way. They seem to have sort of similar characteristics. And I was really interested in trying to make sense of what that was. So when I did this study, I started off fairly smallish study, I guess, for my PhD. And we sort of did a sample of students who identified across different class boundaries. Okay, so I started off finding out what professions their parents did, did a survey, did a questionnaire, and then invited them to take part in interviews. Now, not just what professions their parents did, but also their educational qualifications, the entry route students had taken. And one of the things that came across quite clear to me very quickly was that the model of just asking parents professions was actually not very useful, because actually some students were reporting that their parents did this job now, but they'd been through a whole different journey of jobs before they got to this point. And if we go back to this idea of it's about the root, it's about where they've grown up, that initial questionnaire, when I tried to classify them, wasn't very helpful. So I did semi-structured interviews, and there were all sorts of ethical issues, which I won't go into now, but researching the students that I taught at times was, you know, there were some real ethical challenges which I faced. So in terms of my study, I ended up with a variety of students from different social classes, okay? The students in the bottom, Andre, Vicky, Idris, MJ and Lewis, they grew up in very highly multicultural areas, which was an oversight of my initial study. I forgot about the idea of doing research around social class. I forgot being based in the Greater London area, that actually a lot of the students who identified as lower socioeconomic status, they were actually coming from highly multicultural areas as well. And that influenced some of the other factors that went into it. And I think I would say I have a very London-centric kind of view of this research. But their parents they were cleaners. Some of them were carers working for individuals with disability. One of them drove a lorry. There was all sorts of different things. And then the students, sort of as it went through, the students who had the sort of the higher socioeconomic status, the parents had degrees, they were teachers. We weren't really, no one in my study came from what I was calling an elite background. So there was no one whose background was, you know, parents were bankers or, you know, had gone to independent school. So that was a real sort of something to think about in terms of the study. Now, I rejected, I guess, the initial working class, middle class, upper class terms, because I think in many ways, they are terms we've inherited, but I don't necessarily think that they reflect the social, cultural and economic backgrounds that our young people that come to us now come from. I think, you know, if we look at them, they very much come from an industrialist society, whereas we live in a very different society now. So in terms of grouping the students, things like their parents' jobs did come into consideration, but also the geography of where they lived was one of the factors. Other factors included in it were things around educational attainment, and a number of other factors went into that in terms of how they influenced it. So it was kind of multivariant. So for me, I've got this quote from Imogen Tyler there, which I don't know if any of you can see, but I'm not necessarily interested in classifying people, even though I've spent probably 8 minutes talking about it. I was more concerned with, well, what impact does this have? What impact does individuals coming from a certain background have upon their experience of belonging on a sports course at university? And one of the things that I would point out is a lot of sports courses at universities, going back to Natalie's point she made out earlier, are quite low content hours, okay? And some people would say that's fantastic, and other people would say that that can be a bit of a challenge in itself. So I wanted to understand what processes occurred that made some people feel like they belong and others feel like they didn't. And a big factor, as I said, I mentioned earlier, was that if I look at this slide here, there was this experience that some students spoke about when entering the organisation. Once I did the interviews, one of the things that students from the low socioeconomic background spoke about was the notion of what they described as culture shock. And the students who were from low socioeconomic backgrounds and also BAME, this was a term that many of them used. And they sort of spoke about this idea of when they entered this setting, it was predominantly white, but also some of them were commuting, some of them weren't commuting. It was different. It was very different to where they'd grown up before. And it was also sometimes a sense that sometimes some of them experienced a sense of otherness and exclusion because of this. Others experienced a sense of what they sort of had to assimilate, adapt and change. So if I move on to my next slide, I've got a bit more of an overview of this continuum. So on here, I've got Andre, Lewis and Harry, who are all commuter students. Sorry, Andre and Harry were both commuter students. Lewis was a residential student, okay? And when they were asked about how they felt a sense of belonging, how living off campus, how their social class impact their sense of belonging, you can see here that we've got on one extreme, Andre, who really felt like he didn't belong, felt like he was excluded from the environment. with then sort of Lewis in the middle, who said it was an uncomfortable process. He had to change, he had to adapt, he experienced what would call a cleft habitus, if you like, where almost a splitting of himself and having to change his ways to feel like he fitted in. And then someone like Harry, who was also a commuter student, who was the other end of the spectrum to Andre, who, even though he was from an upper middle class background, even though he commuted, for him, he didn't really have too many friends on the course. He didn't really sort of engage and build relationships with other students. But for him, it didn't feel like it had a big impact on his experience. He didn't feel like it had big influence. So in terms of those things, you could see that this idea of sense of belonging, is it a place for someone like me? That was something that was experienced by a number of the students. And that was something for us as practitioners. For me, it's become really important to think about. Now, the next thing that I then started to ask questions about was, well, what role do university sports clubs play in this? And some of the students were involved in university sports clubs. Some of the commuter students who weren't involved in university sports clubs, again, this played a role in their sense of belonging, played a role in a sense of how well they could do on the course, played a role in how they felt like they sensed to get on with other students. And you can see here that I had the title back here, it's like our little family, okay? And you can see back here that it was a continuum again. So for Andre, sports clubs and societies were a huge issue. He didn't take part, he didn't want to be taking part, he didn't feel that it was somewhere where he could access it, didn't feel like it was something that he could be part of. And that influenced his sense of belonging quite significantly. In comparison to somebody like Harry went along, he tried a sports club, and he went to the tennis society. He saw that it wasn't really about playing tennis, it was about socializing. And for him then, that didn't impact him significantly in the same way as someone like Andre. He said, okay, it didn't really bother me. I'll just get back to, I'll go back to how things were. Now, what's quite interestingly, then I've got other examples, and again, they're examples of, as opposed to being, this is the answer for everyone. People like Vicky over here, she came from low-income background. Her mum was unemployed, had been a carer for a nan for quite a long period of time. And for her, the sports club really created a sense of belonging. So again, it was really important to understand that these institutions run in they have different impacts for different people. One of the things that really came out to me was this notion about hot knowledge. So at the end of it, some students, the students from upper middle class backgrounds who lived on campus and who were heavily involved in sports teams, they really saw it as a source of knowledge which they used, and they would help them to access things like opportunities on campus, find out knowledge about getting onto a PGCE, finding out more information in these areas. And that, for me as a teacher, working in the university, as a lecturer working in the university, something became really important to understand, because they got placement opportunities through friends in sports clubs, whereas some of the students from the other backgrounds were generally sort of going back to their old school, or they didn't have quite, some of them didn't have quite as well developed networks. So that raised the question for me, where do we go from this and what do we do? A common thing that was reported was this idea of a lot of students felt like they were part of the crowd. The course at the time was a lot larger than it is now. And there was a lot of students who felt like at times spoke about being just another number, and felt like staff didn't really know who they were. Now, in terms of being significant, I guess, again, that depended on people's background. A lot of the students from the lower socioeconomic backgrounds prior to this had spoke about a teacher, a coach, a significant other really being central to their journey to university. They really felt like this, they were instrumental. Some of them spoke of them as being like second fathers. Whereas students from the upper sort of the higher socioeconomic backgrounds didn't necessarily speak about it in the same way. So again, this notion of relationships influence students in a different way. Some students really weren't bothered, and we can sort of see a bit of a trend here, whereas other students sort of recognised actually being involved in sport around university, being able to have a conversation with staff at university really helped them. So that participation in the sports club had an influence on that. Now, when we look at why some of the factors why some of the students who were commuter students and from lower socioeconomic backgrounds didn't take part in university sport, one part comes back to the culture shock and their feelings that it wasn't maybe a space they belonged. Another part came back to, you know, having to hang around. They were in, you know, sports clubs ran at 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock at night. Their lectures finished at 2 o'clock. They weren't going to hang around. Others had to work long hours. And, you know, that was another factor that came up. Many of them would prioritize economic jobs which they could get paid through, as opposed to jobs which they could gain experience from. And so that's sort of influenced some of my thinking moving forward with this. So in terms of, I guess, some of my thoughts of where we go from this, I think we have to think about our informal interactions and assumptions sometimes we make about students' experiences. I had one student who fell asleep in lectures. A colleague called him out for falling asleep, and he was really upset about that because he'd fallen asleep because he'd been working long hours and travelled to the university, and that then, you know, his commitment was being called out, whereas there was other students who'd come in and apologised to staff members in another lecture for being hungover, and it was sort of brushed off, and he saw that as a slight. So those informal interactions are really something to think about. I think for me, becoming aware of our own identity and how our identity might be perceived, I think are important things. I think other instrumental things that we've started to do, which maybe aren't on here, but in the last year as a university, we've started to look at mentoring programs for students from low socioeconomic status and BAME backgrounds to create some of the social networks that maybe exist informally with students who are heavily involved in some of the sports clubs. We've looked at things like trying to organise particular coaching qualifications for students from low socioeconomic backgrounds or backgrounds where they're underrepresented, where you don't just get paid by the hour, or if you do get paid by the hour, you can work 4 or 5 or 6 hours in a row. We've sort of noticed that, say something like football or rugby coaching, you work 2 hours after school. A lot of the students say, well, I might as well go and work in Sainsbury's because I can work 5, 6, 7, 8 hours, even though the pay is better. And sometimes we're guilty of, within our programme, promoting the idea that students should all go and get work experience in areas that are professionally related, when that's sometimes with their circumstances quite difficult. So we've looked at sport like tennis. We know that tennis coaches often can work, you know, slightly longer hours. You can work whole days, sort of on the weekends, summer camps, etc. And that's a sport that we looked to target this year before COVID came in. So we started to think about how can we create and facilitate some of those environments which might support some of those students. And yeah, that's me. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Michael. I think that's a really insightful sort of unpacking some of the issues that are present within sort of academia more widely. I think one thing I think I personally like to sort of bring up is, do you think that there is a wider issue potentially in higher education between the step between sort of those secondary schools, those that have had lesser opportunity through maybe the private school system to have those skills for academia, and those that, as you say, have had those role models that are now almost absent in higher education?
So I think it is a wider structural, systematic thing. And I think, I mean, we have very few students at the university I work that come from independent schools. So when I talk about social class, I'm really talking about students whose parents are teachers, parents who are, maybe small business owners within my study. But I think we do work on on assumptions, if you like, that because people are coming in with grade boundaries, that their journey's the same. And I think we really need to understand how we scaffold that journey. I think we need to understand our subconscious biases. I think I'm kind of drawn towards particular students. I sort of sometimes refer to it as, she's kind of not very useful to think with now, but the Slug Club in Harry Potter, where he would all sort of be drawn to the students who show particular qualities. And I think we're all guilty of doing that. But I think you're right, it is a bigger structural thing. It doesn't just happen on sports courses. We have our version of what we think a good student looks like. I think what a student experiences at, say, Cambridge or Oxford, which is where a lot of the original research was done, they'd go to like the most deprived universities. So University of Sunderland seemed to be one that there'd be a lot of research coming out, or Middlesbrough, and then Cambridge, and do a comparison. And actually what was missing was what helps some students get on and others challenge back within our courses, and our courses are different. So yeah, I think you're right. I think it is a bigger question, but yeah.
It's interesting you bring up the Northeast, as somebody who went to Durham but would socially go outside and knew people from Sunderland's university. It's a very interesting comparison. I think a very unfair comparison to be made. And I think you touch upon potentially that we need to consider the individualized aspects and intersectionality of what brings somebody to their place in time, as it were, if we're going very Derrida and
yeah. And I think I rushed through this, but I was very guilty of having a very London-centric lens of social class. So when I'm talking about commuter students, to some extent, there's a heavy BAME intersection, and to some extent, there's a heavy. They have opportunities, possibly more so than students in other regions of the UK as well, right? So, if we look at things like attainment gaps, actually, in terms of areas which have higher levels of deprivation, in terms of education, London does pretty well. So there's so many, I guess, factors that come into it. And I think I've probably touched upon a few things. I think everything I said kind of post-COVID is becoming quite outdated as well. And I think that's something I should have mentioned. Some students now, I know, love the anonymity of online learning. That sense of otherness has been taken away. Some students, it's been extended even further because they're not coming in, seeing people, feeling like it's part of an organisation that they belong. And I think things like size of course play into that as well. So yeah, there's lots of different factors.
I think we're just about out of time, and I'm conscious that, as you say, some people have been on this call for a very long time. So I'll leave it there, and I think there's definitely some wider discussions and some revisiting points post-COVID to explore how maybe COVID either reinstalls or retains these barriers or removes them potentially. And unfortunately, only time will tell. So thank you very much, Michael, and for your presentation. And at this point, I'll hand back to Adam, who will finish us off for our second symposium.
Thanks, Nathan. I think it's actually myself that will be closing this, unless I've just jumped ahead of Adam, but I'll continue on kind of blindly. I'd like to just firstly thank our presenters today for sharing with us their valuable insight and experience as we look to challenge the dominant discourses around inclusion, accessibility, and accountability kind of within and across the sporting landscape. As you've seen today, this has very much been a team effort at Oxford Brookes, certainly a passion project, and one that's been made possible by other colleagues from Brookes you've seen today: Adam White, Rosie Collins, Stuart Wigham, and Nathan Howard, and kind of a whole host of postgraduate students kind of behind the scenes. So we're really, really thankful for their engagement and giving me the opportunity to be involved as well. We're also very grateful to our partner organisations for standing with us on this, UK Coaching and SimSpo. I suppose as participants, spectators, coaches, practitioners, academics, or just as human beings in general, we've all been witness to the incredible power of sport to touch our lives in a myriad of ways. And that, without wanting to sound like I'm quoting Spider-Man, we have to recognise that this is not necessarily a power that always acts for good, inadvertently or otherwise. And in our previous symposia, we've asked where we might draw the line on the pursuit of performance over athlete well-being. And today we have both unpicked and shone a light on the persisting exclusivity of sport in some domains. And in respect to both questions, there's evidence of a growing public dissatisfaction with the status quo. As Rachel rightly said earlier, we might say change is coming, and certainly this might be evident in the voices of our youth. But again, this challenge is not yet over by any means. To paraphrase what Rosie said at the very start of the event, we must be better. And it's the intention of the Athletes series here at Oxford Brookes to shout this charge and to keep the conversation at the forefront of our thoughts and our actions. In light of this, our symposia series will continue, and on the 29th of March this year, we'll be hosting another event titled How Do We Ensure Athletes Thrive in and Out of Sport? And we'd be delighted if you would join us again, spread the word to those in your networks, and to continue this conversation and not let it drop out of the forefront of public thought. With that, I want to finally thank you all for joining us today and for giving us your time. I'm sure everyone's ready to jump off the computer and relax and have a cup of tea. But if you have any remaining questions, please feel free to contact the Athletes team via Twitter or via our staff emails, which is available on the Athletes website. Thank you so much for joining us.